Good evening. This is Radio Free Mormon. In recent years, Mormon apologists are beginning to argue that LGBTQ plus people are better off inside the LDS church than outside the LDS church. Even our good friend, Austin Fife, mentions it in a chapter of his Light and Truth letter. In a different chapter, Austin argues that Jews were actually better off inside the Spanish Inquisition than outside the Spanish Inquisition. But is there any truth to this startling declaration? Or is it just one more deception in a long list of deceptions by defenders of the LDS Church? Join me and find out on this very important episode of Radio Free Mormon. Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. This is Radio Free Mormon on the air, broadcasting behind enemy lines. Tonight is going to be another in our series of episodes dealing with issues raised in the Light and Truth letter. As such, I am once again joined by my esteemed co-counsel, Colby Reddish. Hello, Colby. How are you doing?
Good morning, RFM. I'm doing great. How are you?
Well, it's great to see you again. You're showing up an awful lot on this show for a guy who said he wasn't going to be on the show anymore until April.
I know. I'm a glutton for punishment.
Yes, you are. And I'll take that in the way it was intended, because I know how you meant that. And I'm sure everybody out there agrees. But we're very lucky to have you on. This is going to be a special episode because it was brought up by an individual who took a special interest in a certain chapter of the Light on Truth letter. And it's the chapter that I've been talking about. Mm-hmm. And here he is right now, Jacob Prescott, who is a first-year medical student from somewhere in the United States. Good morning, Jacob. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Well, I'm so glad that you contacted me because you had obviously done a great deal of research on this particular chapter and this particular issue, where it comes from, whether it's true, following the studies and the science that is alleged to support this strange and amazing declaration. Jacob, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you said, I'm a first-year medical student. I obtained my bachelor's in biology from Utah Valley University. I really love studying biology. Colby, I think you've mentioned that you have some sort of bachelor's in biology as well. So that's something we can connect on. And is that from BYU?
It is. Yeah, you made a much smarter decision to go to medical school than law school, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Colby has a degree in micromolecular biology. Yep. That's a lot of syllables. My degree is just in dance. You can say it in one syllable. Dance.
Dance.
Micromolecular biology. Every time you say that, Colby, I want you to know I'm secretly very impressed.
The similarity between our two degrees, RFM, is we both dealt with squishy things, depending on the dancers.
I don't even know what to say about that, but thank you. I'll take that as a compliment. Jacob, do you deal with squishy things?
Yeah, occasionally. I worked in a wet lab when I did some research as a biology student. So
was that here in the United States or in Wuhan?
Utah Valley University, close to Wuhan, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Probably a foreign exchange student.
Yeah. No, I feel, it's funny. I told you, RFM, this recently. I said, I feel like there's a joke like here somewhere, two lawyers and a medical student, all returned missionaries from the Mormon church. They walk into a bar or something like that. But
a wet bar.
No, I love research. I consider myself an ally. I don't know how to characterize myself in the Mormon world exactly right now. I had a
because you are a member.
Yes, I am a member of the church. I had a faith crisis about a year ago, actually. And it's still something that I'm working through. For a while, I called myself ex-Mormon because I feel like that best fit with where I was at with my faith and with my deconstruction. But it's on my mind a lot. And I've been giving church another go, so to speak. My family is all still very active, and so I want to go to support them. And there's still things that I enjoy about church, and but I don't know how to entirely characterize myself and say I'm still a member. I'm still a member of record. I attend church pretty actively. Yeah. So.
Can
And
I
when
make
we talked last night on the phone, Jacob, what did I try and persuade you to do?
Oh, what? I can't remember.
What did I try and persuade you to do as far as your religion?
Oh, to figure it out?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. That was the.
I said, good
And
luck figuring it out.
yes.
And I said, believe it or not, I actually don't try and influence people in their religious journeys. Because it's true, I don't.
Yeah.
So, but we're very glad that you've come on today. And I wanted to ask you this question before we start getting into your research. Why you? Why did you do all this research on this particular issue? And why were you drawn to it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like I said, I've considered myself an ally for a long time. And so while we're talking about that right now, if I say something today, I'm straight. And so if anybody, has any commentary or corrections to give to me today after the show, whenever it's published, I would love to hear them. But because I'm an ally, and this is something that I've focused on, I have, like many of us do, I have friends and family members who are gay or part of the LGBT community. And I think that just for a long time, I've really empathized with their stories, the highs and the lows and the experiences they have in the church, because that can be messy and complicated. And I think that understanding this whole topic is best understood when you ask somebody who's part of that community and is still Mormon or post-Mormon. I feel like this section doesn't do a good job at representing that. And it doesn't do a good job at representing the science and the research that actually has gone into it. So why I wrote this section, why I'm just so passionate, is because I really hope that people can step outside of their own perspective. That's something that I think is just healthy for everybody to do, and see what it's like to live a life that's a lot different from your own. I think that everybody can be an ally, and everybody should be a better ally. And I think this is a springboard for a discussion about that, especially where it intersects with Mormonism. Does that answer that question?
Yes, I think so. So when you're talking about section, you're talking about this section or chapter, as we're calling it, in the Light and Truth letter, where it mentions this argument?
Yes. I call it section sometimes, chapter. Yes, yeah.
It's okay. Just want to make that clear for the audience and to me. And the final thing is this. So how did you get a copy of the Light and Truth letter for you to read through it and find this to respond to it?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of my really good friends that I served with on the mission, we chat a lot. We have a really good relationship. He sent me this letter, and I had lots of thoughts on different chapters. And I think, honestly, you two and the work that you have been doing have summed up a lot of the thoughts that I've had on the chapters. This particular chapter in specifically is what really caught my attention, because I wanted to see what Fife had to say, because this is something that weighed on my mind a lot when I was an active believing Mormon, weighs on my mind a lot now. And so, yeah, I had a friend reach out and send me the Light and Truth letter, and specifically kind of referenced this chapter as a means to try and answer my questions. And I don't think, unfortunately, it did that.
I see. Okay. Well, thank you for that background. And with that background, unless you have any other comments, Colby?
I was just going to say, Jacob, now that you've had your own faith crisis, you said over the course of the last year, just remember that you can write a book about it and sell it for $18 a pop. So
yeah.
But you have to wait 10 years.
Yeah.
That's right. And then I'll say that I want to be anonymous, but then not be anonymous. Is that right?
I really wanted to be anonymous when I put my name on that book.
Yes. Yeah.
No, I appreciate everything you just said. I think it connects a lot with what I've said and the way I feel about this topic. I mean, and the other thing I think is important to recognize is, as much fun as RFM and I have had, debunking some of Austin's historical arguments, I think these types of contemporary issues facing the church are much more important because there are real human costs on the other side of the equation. And that's why I'm really glad that we're going to go through and actually look at what does the science actually say, because nothing offends me more than people who bastardize science and use it to make claims that are basically antithetical to the scientific method. And I know that we'll get to some of these issues as we go through your research today, but I guess that's the other thing I wanted to highlight. It goes hand in hand with what you said about, putting ourselves outside of our experience and trying to learn from other people's experiences. I would just hope that people can sit with that as we go through this material today and think about that human cost that does happen, regrettably, inside the LDS Church.
Yes, this is why I introduced this as an important episode of Radio Free Mormon. I actually think they're all kind of important, but some are more important than others. How's that?
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the most important because of that very reason, Colby. So thank you for bringing that up. Jacob, I'm going to put the first slide up here on the screen. It looks like a page out of Austin Fife's Light on Truth letter.
Okay, great. Yeah. So as we know, with each chapter that Fife starts off with, he usually starts with a quote from somebody he labels as a critic. And I think the way he starts off this time is interesting. The quote says, "Utah is such a hostile place for the LGBT community right now. If you're in Utah and queer, sending you virtual hugs." I looked that exact quote up online. I couldn't find anywhere on Twitter where that quote came from, and there's no link to it. This does sound like something somebody would say in Utah. Sure. But I just thought that that's an interesting anecdote. And in my mind, that's a great criticism, if you want to call it that. I think it's just actually a great way to reach out to people who might be struggling in Utah. I don't see if that's I don't know what the thought process was to start out with that quote, because I don't feel like it ends up really tying into anything.
I'm also not sure what the quote is doing there, because Austin Fife's first chapter talks about how quote mining is a disingenuous and manipulative tactic, but we'll set that aside. RFM, I saw you were trying to say something.
Yes, thank you. I think that what he's trying to do is to set up by quotes a position held by critics of the church, which he is now going to refute.
Mm-hmm.
So he's talking about someone quoting somebody that Utah is such a hostile place for the LGBTQ plus community, and he's going to refute that now with his research.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's take a look at the research in just a second. I think starting out with this story, I want to give 5 points and credit where it's due, so to speak. And I think this story is decent that he starts out with. He's I'll read some of it. He talks about how early in high school and while he was growing up, it was commonplace for him to say derogatory terms, offensive things to LGBT individuals. And I think that's something that unfortunately is a common story for many of us. And he says he was never personally hostile towards this group of people, but he was avoidant. And then he shares a story about on the mission. He says he served a mission in Peru. His companion and I were teaching a less active family with some unbaptized members. The aging grandmother lived in a home as well. The less active members were focused on incredibly neglectful and rude to the grandmother. It was shameful and despicable. The only one in the home that treated the grandmother with kindness and compassion was the gay uncle. Unlike his less active Latter-day Saint sister, he was sweet and honoring of his mother. That one man humanized a group that I had been evading. I was upset that I was teaching the gospel of Jesus Christ to his heterosexual, neglectful sister, but avoiding him. I was called to repentance and reminded that the gospel is for all of God's children. I think that's actually a pretty good story to start out on and say, look, I had this opinion, I had this worldview, maybe some bias, and that changed when I realized that, this group of people are people just like me, and they're really good people. So I think that's a solid foot to start on.
I think it is. I like the way he subtly tries to work in there the idea that it's because the gay uncle was more faithful in the LDS church that he was kinder to his grandmother, where it says, unlike his less active Latter-day Saint sister, he was sweet and honoring of his mother. I see what you did there.
Yeah, the other thing that really stands out to me about this is I think this is a lot of people's experience with any type of marginalized group. I think this is one of the reasons that the church's policies can be so draconian to LGBTQ people and make, them wanting to be in the church so difficult, is because the more you have experiences with people who are different from you, you start to humanize them. And so I definitely give Austin props for recognizing that happened. And that's where I would just encourage people, along with this marginalized group and others, to make those connections, because when we do that, it is so hard at that point for us to other and to write off those groups. And so there is that part of me that's like, my sinister warning bells are going off because of the church's history of doing that. But kudos to Austin for recognizing the cure to that is spending time with people who are different than you. It's hard to hate people who you know.
Right. Unless his name's Jacob Hansen.
You had to. I knew it.
I'm so sorry. People are going to look back on this 20 years from now and say, what the hell was up with Jacob Hansen? Jacob,
People say that now.
Not Jacob Hansen, but Jacob Prescott, the good Jacob. All right. If this is a Star Trek episode called Mirror, Mirror, you're like the good Jacob. Okay. He's the bad Jacob with the mustache and the goatee. And so, Jacob, tell me whenever, just say slide or next whenever you want.
Oh, yeah. And you can go to the next slide now.
All right.
So then he jumps into, and this is something that sets a tone in this chapter of the Light and Truth letter, and that's critiquing Dr. John Dehlin's research. And this is something that we'll talk a lot about later on. For right now, let's just see what's on this slide, and I'll jump into my commentary.
Do you want me to read that, Jacob?
Oh, actually, yeah, if you would.
Yeah. In 2015, prominent church critic and podcast host Mormon Voldemort John Dehlin published a dissertation through Utah State University titled Sexual Orientation, Change Forms, Identity Conflict, and Psychosocial Health Amongst Same-Sex Attracted Mormons. In his research, he concludes that sexual orientation change efforts, SOCE, by members and former members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were overwhelmingly reported to be either ineffective or damaging by participants. He derived the study's results from 1,612 individuals who responded to an online survey. Are those who identify as LGBTQ+ more at risk among the Latter-day Saints? Do they experience worse outcomes due to their membership in the church?
Well, Austin's going to be thrilled with us today because he's been yelling at us that he asked the questions. He's been mad at us because we haven't answered his questions enough. Well, we're going to be drilling in right on those two questions.
Can I point out why? Can I point out why we're willing to answer these questions? It's because these are actually non-fallacious questions for one of the first times throughout his whole letter. They're actually valid questions to say, do we actually see this? That's the basics of the scientific method. And so that's why we're willing to answer them. The only reason we haven't been willing to answer the ones in the past is because they often have the conclusion baked into the premise.
Well, he thinks he has the goods on this one. We're going to find out he doesn't really, but he thinks he does. By the way, I'm also wary of the fact that we could be falling into another trap.
Okay, I think we're good to go to the next slide.
Okay.
And I think I'll just sum up some thoughts I had about this, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, about what we just read, which is when you are questioning a scientific study, the critique or the question, it has to apply to the study. It has to apply to the results of the study. Austin asked the question, are Latter-day Saints who are part of the LGBT community, are they more at risk? And as far as I'm aware, I breezed through Dr. Dehlin's dissertation. There's no at-risk category contained in the dissertation. It says that attempting to change one's sexual orientation is ineffective or damaging. So it's not that they're at risk of it being ineffective or damaging, it's that it is, period. And so I think, and something that we'll see a lot with a lot of the scientific studies that we're going to dive into today, is that sometimes the questions that Fife asks or the conclusions that Fife reaches with what he's read about these scientific articles, it doesn't even apply. It doesn't even work into the conclusions of the actual study. And
it sounds like Nahum, doesn't it?
Yeah, yes, it
I mean, he
reminds
didn't
me.
even read these studies, for crying out loud. He didn't read the sources he cited for Nahum or anything else. So I think it's highly unlikely he read the sources for this. And if he did, he wouldn't be able to understand them anyway. I don't know that I would have a great job understanding them, which is why we have you on, Jacob. And Jacob, can you tell the audience why it is that you can understand this stuff and read this and understand it so well?
Well, I think, and this is something actually that I've heard Dan McClellan say. For those of you who know who Dan McClellan is, something he says a lot on his channel is the skill to think critically and Google competently. I think that's something that everybody can do. And I think that's something that we should all just get practice doing more, right? And specifically with topics like this is something that I try and think critically about a lot and try and Google competently a lot. And it just takes practice. I think that's something we can all do. I've done research in the past. I've published some research in the past. And so I feel familiar enough with how to dive into a scientific research article to be able to say, hey, this is the actual conclusion reached here. To answer your question.
Well, I'll tell you, when you interpret it for me, I feel like I can understand it better because as I understand what you're saying, John Dehlin's survey has to do with a bunch of people. I think it was 1,600 plus people. And the response that they had to this kind of, hang on a second, let me go back here to what he said, right? That sexual orientation change efforts, okay? This is not just LGBTQ plus people generally who are members of the church versus those who are not. This is those who are almost certainly members of the church, but it doesn't really make that much difference. What it has to do with whether what their response was to these sexual orientation change efforts that they underwent, and that those were overwhelmingly reported to be either ineffective or damaging by participants, either ineffective or damaging by participants. And then he tries to talk about that under the category of, is the LGBTQ plus Latter-day Saint community more at risk or outside the church? And that sounds like apples and oranges to me.
Yeah.
That was actually going to be my single biggest question too, for Jacob before we got going through the actual research. Is it does seem like an apples to oranges comparison to me. And I'll say, to the church's credit, they no longer recommend basically conversion therapy or those sexual orientation change efforts, as at least as far as I understand. That's generally not the advice that's given. But does that affect this at all, Jacob? Is it an apples to oranges comparison in that sense?
Yeah, I would say it is, because it doesn't, the questions and the critiques, and I think it's important to question and critique a study always, but the questions and the critiques, they don't apply to the actual results that came from the study. They don't apply to how the study was actually done. And I think how Austin does that, and I think he probably comes by that honestly, it becomes clear that he might have some internal bias that comes into how he interprets a study and then ends up misrepresenting it. Does that answer the question?
I think it does. This is stuff we go through even before we get to the study itself. We look at how it's being applied and the analysis that Austin's doing. I agree with you, Colby. The church should be commended not doing this kind of sexual orientation therapies anymore. And I'm even prouder of President Oaks because he no longer was president of BYU when they were actually doing this stuff there.
That's true.
Something like that. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to cover on this slide, unless either of you wanted to make any more comments.
No.
Okay, and let's try and breeze through the next couple ones here. Would one of you
another slide from the Light on Truth letter?
Yeah, would one of you be willing to read this real quick?
I can. I've wondered, says Austin pensively, I've wondered for the last 10 years how damaging the church is to the mental health of our LGBTQ plus brothers and sisters. From the comments of critics like John Dehlin, it really seemed like we were doing more harm than good. However, I also had personal experience where LGBTQ plus identifying members of the church were greatly blessed by their membership. So which is it? I wish he could say what the personal experience was and how he's saying that they were blessed, but he doesn't.
I also just think it's hilarious that he's talking about, something obtained through the scientific method, a study that John did, versus anecdotes. That's literally the second category that he's talking about. Well, I've got personal anecdotes that don't agree with this data, and I know that Jacob's going to walk us through the data a little bit more in depth, but even just there, like, obviously problematic thinking to think that personal anecdotes that he's realized versus collected survey data are equivalent.
Great point. And the anecdotes and what he's talking about has nothing to do with what John Dehlin was studying anyway.
Right.
Still, the same apples and oranges problem are dogging this chapter. Jacob?
Yeah, so I think I have a lot of thoughts with this, and if we could actually just move to the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
When Austin asks, which is it? I think that sets up a bit of a false dichotomy. People are either harmed by the church if they're LGBT, or they're hurt by the church. And that's just not the case. There's a much more nuanced conversation.
Jacob, I think he said they're either harmed by the church or they're hurt by the church.
Oh, sorry. Harmed or benefit.
Or they're not harmed by the church. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And that's just not true. I mean, I think we all know somebody who was in the church who's gay or part of this community and who is happy and benefits from the relationships that they have with people in the church. And that can work for a time. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, theology can get in the way and really come back and hurt these people. I have friends who've served missions who are gay, and the entire time that they served a mission, they were very committed. And at the time, they would have said that they were very happy in the church. And now they frame things a little differently. And so I just don't think the world is black and white. I think that there are going to be people who are members of the church and feel happy in the church, and they are part of the LGBT community. And there are also people who've left the church who've been really harmed because of the church. But it's not just one or the other. Does that make sense?
It almost does seem like they feel they can measure it down to the percentile. And if they've got someone who's 51% or more happy in the church and gay, then that counts on their side. And if they're 50% or 49% and lower and gay in the church being happy, then it counts against them.
Well, and the other thing that I'm struck by, I really like your comments on this slide, Jacob, because not just for members of the LGBT community, I think this false binary continues even to ex-Mormons like myself. Like, I don't look at every experience I had in the church, even overall, as all harm. There are things, and paradoxically, there are actually things that I view as maybe harmful in some ways that I'm actually very glad gave me certain taught me certain lessons or gave me certain experiences that I am grateful for. That there are things I guess what I'm saying is there are things in the church that I think harmed me, and that would carry over, I think, to members of this community, that I'm also paradoxically grateful for, in that they made certain things in my life easier, or they helped me avoid certain problems. So I think you're right. I think we do have a bit of a false binary going on, because it's a much more mature perspective to set that aside and go, it's not either all harm or all good. Sometimes harm can actually lead to good. I mean, that's the basics of a lot of medicine, right? Is dealing with dosage and whether the treatment warrants, or the cure warrants the treatment, or the disease warrants the treatment based on the advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, I just think there's a whole nuanced conversation to have with this. And actually, I think if you dig into all the research that Austin gives you, you can come away with a pretty good understanding of the nuance that comes with this conversation, which thankfully is what we're doing today, as far as I understand.
Well, nuance and apologetics don't normally go together.
Yeah. Okay, and on this next one, so just as we read this section, remember why Austin feels so far, for what we know about why Fife feels like we can't trust Dehlin's research. Is he biased?
His mischaracterization of Dehlin's research.
His character, yes, thank you.
Mischaracterization.
Yeah. And then Colby, would you mind just reading this slide real fast?
In a 2016 paper, Stephen Cranny reports on the mental and physical health among Utah Mormon LGBs and non-Mormon LGBs using a large population-based data set. He reports, in a surprising finding, Mormon LGBs report better mental health than non-Mormon LGBs. Why are LGBs' mental health better off as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? Why was this finding so surprising? I've already got thoughts, but I want to hear yours first, Jacob.
Yeah, so let's go to the next slide real fast, RFM.
It's surprising because no normal person would think that was true.
I also think it's important before... you're looking at the paper. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, do you want to say something? Go ahead, Colby.
I just wanted to very carefully note this is all occurring inside of Utah. So that is a very important caveat to this data, and will maybe inform... Maybe I'm signposting my thoughts on this already, but let's go to the next slide.
And it's not LGBT or Q because it's strictly just LGB in the study, and that's why I think it's called that, correct?
Yes. And so on this slide, you can see that I pulled up that research, and it says the LGBT Mormon paradox, mental, physical, and self-rated health among Mormon and non-Mormon LGBT individuals in the Utah Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. And it has one author, and that's Dr. Cranny or Cranny. I'm not entirely sure which way you pronounce it. And well, so I looked up, Stephen Cranny, Mormon. And what pops up, and you can go on to the next slide. It's also included on this one.
Okay, and don't slide past that too fast. He's a Mormon.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's a Mormon.
I see we've got
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
He's a Mormon who's going to do a study that ends up finding, surprisingly, that gay people are better off inside the LDS church than they are outside the LDS church. That's the first thing, because whenever I hear that, I think Coca-Cola just issued a study, surprisingly finding that Coca-Cola is actually really good for you.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it feels like. Sorry, go ahead, Colby.
Well, and to the point of bias, so you were saying that one of Austin's biggest critiques of John Dehlin's work is bias. Here we have, it looks like Stephen Cranny's landing page at Fair Mormon, or formerly Fair Mormon, an apologetics institute that turns out just absolutely some of the worst, most biased apologetics I've ever seen. So we're already in this weird space where he's basically, well, you critics rely on this biased information. And again, we've already talked about he's kind of misrepresenting the way Dehlin's research is meant to be used in the first place. But he's going to cure that bias with the completely objective reporting of someone who does work in conjunction with Fair Mormon. That's kind of hilarious to me.
It is. Fair Mormon, responsible for more members leaving the church than John Dehlin.
Yeah, I mean, you two just summed up the exact thoughts that I had when I came across this. And I don't think that it's a good reason to throw out this research, right? I feel like that's a little too ad hominem-y, if I can eat.
Oh, no. This is a simple analysis of bias, which means we need to factor in bias whenever we're testing the credibility of a witness.
Well, I feel like you two would know something about that.
This is part of the two lawyers and the med student go into the bar joke.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And
two lawyers and a med student go into a bar with a Mormon apologist.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe that's where I would offer a little more pause there. I can see exactly what you're saying. I don't want to throw out the study entirely just based on the fact that he works as an apologist at FAIR, and I agree with your characterization.
It simply serve to make us cautious.
Yes. Well, and if we're supposed to apply the same worry about bias that Fife has to all of the studies that he references, this one shouldn't make the list at all.
Can I read something from this page?
Yes.
I don't know if you planned on doing it, but man, this phrase just caught my eye and I couldn't believe I read it. I assume that if I was born in ancient Rome, so this is from Stephen Cranny's author page at FAIR. I assume that if I was born in ancient Rome, I would be okay with the institution of slavery, if only for the mere fact that, as we can tell, virtually everybody in that society was. So I have no particular reason to believe that I would be any different. So to some extent, my current anti-slavery attitudes, holy cow, this is like a Book of Mormon run-on sentence. So to the extent my current anti-slavery attitudes are the results of the fluke of me happening to have been born in a particular time and place where virtually nobody is okay with slavery, but that doesn't mean that slavery is okay or that my reasons for not believing in slavery are illegitimate. Wow.
And I
Okay.
cross-referenced that lengthy sentence with the short sentence he begins his introduction with, which is, I was born into the Mormon church.
Yeah. So I think, I think just reading that.
Colby, I'm sorry, Jacob. Colby, I hit that really hard right after you were done reading it. You probably had something to say after reading all of that.
No, and I'm not trying to Jacob's concern, I'm not trying to ad hominem Stephen Craney. I don't know him. That's kind of a mind-boggling sentence for me to write. I'm not even sure I necessarily disagree with it. Of course, people's context and where they're raised affects the way they feel about moral situations. But that's a very logical position to take as an atheist or as someone who doesn't necessarily believe in a interventionist theistic God. It's a very odd position for someone to take who does believe in an interventionist theistic God. And I always just get troubled with how comfortable people are for making excuses for slavery. That's why it stood out to me.
Yeah, and it looks like he's making an allowance for the possibility of his being biased by his Mormonism.
Sure.
While
So yes,
trying to
I agree with
assuage
your
us.
concern, Jacob. We're not trying to poison the well with this. It's just I'm looking at this in detail for the first time, and so I'm just commenting what stands out to me.
Right.
No, and I think this is really important context because it sets up. I mean, I feel like when Fife quotes this research, it's going to set up a lot of the argument that he brings forward in the rest of this chapter, which we'll get into.
And Fife does cite to this in his letter.
Yes.
Okay.
And then if you perfect. This slide just kind of sums up the research section of this chapter. And I'll just read it real fast. It says there are 15 references in Fife's surprising LGBT section of this chapter. 8 are research articles, 7 are news articles. So right out of the gate, a news article is not a research article.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's 8 research articles. Of those 8, 5 are actually about the LGBT experience within religion or with spirituality. And if you're going to have this section that quotes research about the LGBT experience in religion, it has to apply to those. It can't just be about people's experience with religion generally, because that's kind of a different group, right?
Right.
And then breaking that down even more. Of those 5, there are 2 he quotes directly, and both are authored or co-authored by Dr. Michael Goodman, who's a BYU professor. So that should clue you in if we're supposed to avoid bias. Don't know about that. And then the other 3 that he quotes are misrepresented or misquoted. So misquoted. Yeah.
Let's look at them.
Yeah.
Fascinating. I'm glad you did such a deep dive and so much research on this.
Yeah, thank you. I'm anxious to hear what you two have to say as well. So now we're going to get into a lot of the research or news articles that Fife is going to quote here. Would one of you be willing to read this slide?
Colby?
The surprising finding listed above is increasingly less surprising. In the 2023 report, a large representative sample, almost 74,000, of Utah, again, we're only looking at Utah here, of Utah middle schoolers and high schoolers found that LGBTQ identifying youth in Utah were at a much higher risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors than heterosexual youth. However, Latter-day Saint LGBT in identifying youth reported lower rates of suicidal thoughts and behaviors than non-Latter-day Saint LGBTQ identifying youth.
Okay, perfect. So I feel like, and we can go to the next slide.
Can I just say something about this?
Yeah.
I think the problem is, well, one problem with interpreting this data is that these are Mormon kids, okay? They're Mormon LGBTQ plus kids. How do they know they're Mormon? Well, they've asked them, right? So we know that they're Mormon. We also know that being Mormon, being an active Mormon, being an observant Mormon, and a believing Mormon means that we understand that we are supposed to be happy because we're told we're supposed to be happy. We are told by our leaders that if we obey the commandments, we do what we're supposed to do as good Mormons, we will be happy, which ends up meaning that when a Mormon is asked whether they're happy, what they're thinking is not, I'm either happy or I'm sad, because that's not the opposite of happy to a Mormon. The opposite of happy to a Mormon is sinning. If you're happy, you're obedient. If you're unhappy, you're sinning. Therefore, to ask a Mormon if they're happy is going to be more likely to elicit a yes response, because you're asking them if they're being a good Mormon, even though you may not be aware of it at the time, that's really what you're asking.
Yeah, no, I love that, RFM. The other obvious problem, and this is what I was trying to signpost with the way these studies are conducted, is why I carefully noted these are studies done in Utah so far exclusively, is because if we're really thinking like scientists and we're trying to test these hypotheses, they should be also doing the same study outside of Utah to see, is it Mormonism inside of Utah, where it's the majority religion, where it's the majority of your community, because the beneficial aspects that they're noticing here could be the result of being in a majority group, regardless of what that majority group is. In other words, if we really wanted to test these hypotheses and be able to accurately represent, if we wanted research that would accurately support what Austin Fife is suggesting here, we would need that type of study that basically actually gets to the bottom of cause, not just correlation.
Jacob?
Yeah, I think those are great points. I especially, because what I thought about a lot too was how I was raised Mormon. And that was, it's the plan of happiness, plan of salvation, plan of happiness. And just I'm not sure what to call it, but constantly I'm barraged with, if you're living a good Mormon life like you're supposed to be doing, you're going to be happy. And so if there are these LGBT youth and they're filling out this survey, that you have to keep that in mind, that they could very easily be influenced by their religious theology to answer that they're happier than maybe they are. And that's just something you have to keep in mind when you're looking at this.
And by the way, this also goes double for another study that doesn't have to do with LGBTQ plus people, but just people in general being more happy in the Mormon church than outside of the Mormon church. It's the same thing. It's the exact same thing. A faithful Mormon will tell you they're happy even when they're miserable. And if you don't believe me, go to the next fast and testimony meeting in your ward.
Well, and to people who would say,
where people cry over the horrible things that are going on in their life while they're proclaiming how true the church is and how happy they are to be a member of it. We've all seen it. Don't deny it.
We've all seen it beyond just fast and testimony meeting. We've seen it at funerals. Like I had a family member of ours, a direct family member on my wife's side, that they lost their toddler. He had a genetic disorder and passed. And his funeral was and I was still a fully believing member at the time. His funeral was one of the weirdest events I've ever been to, because everyone was just focused on happy. And it's one of these feelings that for some reason in the LDS church, and I was as guilty of it as everyone else, because exactly like RFM said, we're taught from such a young age that negative feelings, including sadness, come from Satan, literally come from the devil. And if you give over to them, then you're not being faithful. You're not exercising hope. You're not thinking about Jesus Christ. And to people who would say that we're straw manning Mormonism, and that's not true, I would point them right to Mosiah 2:41. This is a scripture I used all the time, where King Benjamin said,
remember.
Moreover, I would that you would remember on the blessed and happy state of those that keep the commandments of God, for they are blessed in all things, both temporally and spiritually, until they are received at the resurrection, or however it ends. RFM could probably recite it for me.
Remember. It starts off with those two words. I remember that.
I cut those out, but
I did have it memorized at one point.
My point is that this isn't a straw man of Mormonism. Like these threads that we're talking about date right back to the Book of Mormon. And if you're someone who was born in the church or converted to the church like RFM did, you're going to be hit with this message the entire time that you're in the church. That if you're giving in to if you're giving into any hard feeling, that it's a sign of some lack of worthiness or some moral failing on your part. And it's one of the greatest releases I've experienced since leaving the church is now being able to sit with hard feelings instead of running away from them all of the time.
Well, it's the second greatest release I've experienced since leaving the church. So you've got me there.
Please
By
don't
the
tell
way,
us about the first.
it is Mosiah 2:41. Remember is in there. It's not at the beginning, though. And moreover, by the way, I'm reading this because this is the seminary scripture. This is the proposition that we've been talking about, which is in LDS scripture. And moreover, I would desire that ye should consider on the blessed and happy state of those that keep the commandments of God. For behold, they are blessed in all things, both temporal and spiritual. And if they hold out faithful to the end, they are received into heaven, that thereby they may dwell with God in a state of never-ending happiness. Oh, remember the 5th of November. No, oh, remember that these things are true, for the Lord God hath spoken it. So absolutely, that's what the LDS Church teaches.
Yeah. And you've just got to keep that in mind. And then if we go to the next slide, I think this is interesting. When I put something in red, it's because it's come directly from the research or maybe the news article that's referenced from the Light and Truth letter. And I'll just read this emphasized sentence at the end of what the researchers concluded from what Fife just referenced. These findings demonstrate the potential familial and religious risk that LGBTQ youth may experience in Utah. So even the researchers themselves reach a different conclusion than what's implied by Fife in the previous slide that we just looked at, which is, look, there is a religious risk that these kids face who are part of this community. And they acknowledge that, but it's not acknowledged by Fife. Why is it not acknowledged by him? I have no idea.
Well, number one, because it doesn't help his argument, and number two, because he never read it in the first place. Colby?
Well, and I know that we have a lot of material to cover, but I wanted to read the sentence right before that, if that's okay. It says, this study found that both Latter-day Saint and non-Latter-day Saint LGBTQ youth are at a higher risk for experiencing suicidal thoughts and behaviors than their heterosexual or cisgender peers. This comes back to the comment I was making a second ago about you're probably going to need more than one study to really get to the bottom of having a valid scientific evidence to make the claim that Austin wants to make. Is if you look at it right there, it basically says that what is the determining factor here? Both Latter-day Saint and non-Latter-day Saint LGBT youth are at a higher risk. So it's their identification with that community or being part of that LGBT community that increases the risk. And because that carries over between both Latter-day Saint and non-Latter-day Saint, I already see a huge problem with the conclusion that Austin wants you to reach. He's basically saying maybe it's better for the LGBT LDS youth than it is for the non-Latter-day Saint LGBTQ youth in Utah. But that makes the exact point that I would use to explain this data, which is they're better off because they're in the majority group of the majority religion in a state. And so because they're part of that majority group, it really doesn't matter what that majority group is what I would think. That would be the hypothesis I want to test. So I'd want to go to a different state where Mormons are a minority and test there. That's how we would get valid data to reach the conclusion Austin wants to reach off data that he just can't use to get there. Is that accurate, Jacob?
That's kind of what I say in this black text down here is like, just there's the conclusion that's reached by the researchers of this article kind of implies that not that the church has a protective factor, but that if you're not part of the majority group of a religious majority group, that might actually play a role in you having maybe poorer mental health. And it's not because it's like better for you to be part of that religion, but because you're not part of that majority group, and there is some stress that comes along with that. So I think that's what you were saying, and I had very similar thoughts.
Great.
I also see Austin saying that he's trying to argue that LGBTQ youth are better off in the LDS church than they are outside the LDS church. But what I really think he's trying to say is it's bad for LGBTQ youth in the church, but it's even worse outside the church. That's really what he's trying to. It's like a tu quo quo. Yeah, it's bad in the church, but it's even worse out there. So don't worry about it. That's actually a good thing. It's an evidence for the church that it's bad for LGBTQ plus people in the church because it's even worse outside the church.
Yeah, which is an interesting take and has nothing to do with what the researchers' conclusion actually said.
Yeah, and I guess my one last little thought I'll say, and Jacob, correct me here if I'm wrong, but if the point that Austin wanted to make were true, what the scientific evidence would say is that LGBT LDS youth, their risk for suicidal thoughts and those behaviors that I think they call it STB, it should be consistent with the Latter-day Saint non-LGBTQ youth. That's what I would expect. If what Austin wants to be true were true, the scientific evidence would show that Mormonism, it's the being Mormon that gives you this level, but we don't see that. We see that there's a different level between Mormon, LGBT, and non-LGBT youth. So that already in my mind is telling me there's some other explanatory factor going on than just Mormonism here.
Well, yes. And what Austin is saying, the other explanatory factor is the church is true, or it's better. It treats them better than the outside cold, harsh world does.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next slide.
And I'll just sum this up real fast. If I took as deep of a dive into every single thing, we'd be here for super long. And so this one says, Dyer and Goodman published a report in 2022 that Latter-day Saint LGBTQ teens had lower levels of suicidality and depression than those teens of other religions or no religion.
Okay, there's that Goodman name you mentioned.
Yeah, so of the articles and the research that Fife quotes directly in this section of the chapter, Dr. Goodman, who works at BYU, as far as I understand, and is active, he's one of the only people quoted directly.
He has to be by definition if he's a professor at BYU, right?
That's a good point. Yes. Yeah.
Temple recommend holding.
Yep.
Do you know this 2022 report? Do you know which state the data came from?
I don't off the top of my head. No.
I'm going to see if I can find it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Commentary?
And say that again, RFM.
Your commentary, Jacob, while Colby's looking.
Yeah, I actually, and something I don't think I wrote into this commentary, but it's interesting that this study talks about LGBTQ youth, so trans youth, and that's something that's consistently, I would say, just not as well researched. It just in general, the intersection of trans youth with religion or trans youth with no religion, there's just not a ton of research that I'm aware of that talks about this. But what we see a lot of the time with research on trans youth is that they're very often bullied and they face a lot of discrimination and a lot of harm from, just society in general. And so it's interesting that, to me, in this study, trans youth, wasn't included. I think the results would have been different if they were. That's all.
Okay, I'll go to the next slide. Are you still looking, Colby?
Yeah, I'm having trouble finding it. I'll see if I can find it while we keep going.
Okay, well, if you go to the Light and Truth letter, you can go to footnote 4 there. I'm sure it'll work for you. Go ahead, Jacob.
Yeah, so then we come across some more research. The researchers found, as quote says, that religiousness/spirituality is consistently and positively associated with better health. And then I think we can just go to the next slide and look at some commentary I have.
By the way, we're also just taking self-reports on health as well.
Yes, and
these guys aren't going through to the doctor for physicals or anything.
No, as far as I'm aware, with this study.
So we're taking what they say about their own health, plus what they say about their own spirituality and religiousness, and what they say about their own happiness. Happiness, we understand, cannot be detected by a doctor.
As far as I'm aware.
Right.
This is one reason that sociology or these types of studies, and I don't mean this pejorative, it's just a limitation of the field, right? There's no way to hook someone up to a machine and measure happiness, is generally referred to as a soft science, because in the hard sciences, you can run math, you can definitively prove something, to any reasonable person. Every time I say definitively prove, I know there's going to be some convenient solipsist that comes along and say, well, how do you know you're not a brain in a vat? I get that all the time. But that's where I say prove to any reasonable person. Do you have any thoughts on that, Jacob? I know it's a limitation of the field, so we would see that across sociological studies that also support views that I hold. For example, I'm just noting that people should be aware when we're dealing with self-reported data upon self-reported data, it is just an inherent limitation of the field. Correct?
Yeah, correct. And self-reported data, it has its pros and it has its cons. What I think makes that interesting, especially in the context of this conversation, is Fife will later bring up, we can't trust self-reported data because that's what Dehlin relied on in his study. And so that makes it complicated if you can't rely.
Well, it makes it contradictory, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Careful, though. If we start criticizing a double standard, it may just be a trap, like RFM said again. Who knows?
Yeah. Who said again? Admiral Akbar?
Yeah.
I think Austin Fife he's an action figure of Admiral Akbar.
Admiral Akbar.
He got promoted.
The greatest Star Wars character.
That's because he is very, very clever and he knows a trap when he sees one.
That's right.
Are you ready for the next slide?
Yes. I think something to note too is that this study lumped religiousness / spirituality in the same category. And those are not always the same things, right? They just said, are you religious or spiritual? And people said, yes. And you can be spiritual and religious. And so that's something important to keep in mind in the context of this study is sometimes Fife likes to quote these things and say, look, if you're religious, it looks like it's better for you to be religious. It's better for your mental health and your physical health for you to be religious. And with this study in particular, we can't reach that same conclusion because they could just be spiritual, whether that's meditation or grabbing your morning coffee, whatever you want to do. And so just to quote what the researchers said from this, the degree to which religiousness or spirituality promotes or harms sexual minorities' health depends on where the individual is in their sexual identity development and integration, what their current religious or spiritual beliefs, practices, and motivations are, and how well the environmental circumstances support their sexual or religious identities. And something else that you can see if you're watching this slide is on real quick, if you can go to the previous slide, RFM, I think he may have quoted this before a correction was given on the study because it says they found that religiousness and spirituality was consistently and positively associated with better health. But if you go to the next slide, the researchers issued a correction after combing through their data, and they said that it was a small but positive overall relationship, so not consistent.
And when it's small, there's almost the implication there. I mean, there's a margin of error that's at work here. And something that's small on one side or the other of the line can be and often is within the margin of error.
Yes. Yeah. Good point. Yeah, and I didn't have access to this full article, so I couldn't see what their standard deviation is. And because that I would love to have access to that because there might be a small but positive overall relationship, but if it's within a margin of error, then there might be no relationship there at all.
And combining this religiousness and spirituality in the same group, is it a problem that Mormonism is quite distinct and proudly distinct from spirituality? In fact, Mormonism would look down on spirituality that existed in a person outside of activity in the LDS church.
Yeah, I think a very Orthodox members would definitely agree with you. Progressive members, maybe not.
Well, it's like if you've got your spirituality LGBTQ people, right? And you've got your religious people who are in the Mormon church. Let's just say those are two categories. And the people in the Mormon church are kind of a little bit less happy. And the people who are just spiritual are happier. And they're actually happier enough to take over the lack on the Mormon side of happiness. You know what I mean? So you got the Mormons here a little bit below the line. You got the spiritual people are here. You combine the two groups together and then you apply them to Mormonism and you get a completely wrong result.
Yeah, or if they're the same, so let's just say that they're about the same. That's not that actually would contradict the conclusion that Fife wants people to reach, which is that Mormonism is good for people who are in the LGBT community. But if that's shared amongst all religious and spiritual people, when Jacob said that some people can be spiritual and not religious, I was going to cite David Bednar as a good example of someone who's religious but not spiritual. But when we look at that, if the level is we're seeing the same positive benefit, regardless of which religion or if you're just spiritual, that actually completely undercuts the ultimate point Austin's trying to make, doesn't it, Jacob? Or am I missing something here?
I think that's brilliant. What do you think, Jacob?
No, I think you're right. It does.
Yeah. So if they're different, the way I described, it can skew things. If they're the same, then it obviates the need for Mormonism in order to make LGBTQ people feel happier, right? Because if they're spiritual, they're just as happy.
Yeah, that would be much more consistent with what I'm guessing is going on here, assuming that there is some validity to any of this data, right? With the caveats of it's all self-reported, is maybe, just maybe, being part of a close, tight-knit community, which we tend to find in religious communities, is what explains the benefit, regardless of what religion it is. That indicates that it's not about any one religion, as Austin needs it to be to make his case for Mormonism. It's literally just about having any religion. That indicates that none of them can use this as a solid argument for why they're good for the LGBTQ community.
And this research being done by a BYU professor, correct, Jacob?
This one is not done by a BYU.
This is a different article.
Okay. Yeah. Well, then they wouldn't have any reason to just limit it to Mormonism. Well, they might, but still. So we've got any kind of religion, any kind of spirituality. Got it. Any other things before we go on?
No, I think we should go on to the next one.
Okay.
There's some interesting things that come from this study. I'll read it real quick. 2020 study in 11 Muslim countries, researchers found that religiosity deters suicide through its effect on attitudes towards suicide. I wonder if
it's against the commandments.
Yes. I wonder if he changed because he made some updates
this month. He announced them on Reddit.
You're welcome.
Twice.
It's a thankless job. I wonder if he updated this. I have some screenshots of what I originally wrote a response to, and maybe I'll have to find those later. Because I can't remember.
Okay, we will take that caveat into account as we proceed.
Okay, yeah. If we just go to my commentary here, first of all, we can't. This study is about 11 Muslim countries, which is a good thing. We should, if we can study any group and any group of people, that's great. But how can that be generalizable to the Mormon community? That doesn't make any sense right off the bat. Second of all, this does not.
Can I pause you?
Yes.
Can I pause you? The reason is because that's what I was saying, right? Is if we're seeing the same type of effect in Muslim countries that we're seeing that Fife wants to highlight in Mormonism, that blows a hole in what he's actually ultimately trying to argue here. Is that the point you're making?
Yes, it is. Sorry, having some notifications going off. But yeah, the groups here.
RFM and I don't have any friends, so that's okay.
No notifications here. Does that mean you have to get to the ER stat?
What the ER stat?
Does that mean
no?
I'm
not even close to doing anything like that.
I've always wanted to say that.
And this study doesn't even focus on the LGBT community. It just focuses on how in Muslim countries their attitudes towards suicide determine how often suicide or self-harm and things like that occur. And so
are you suggesting that Austin Fife found completely irrelevant data that supported a conclusion he may have wanted to make, even if it's not directly connected? Jacob, that seems a little harsh, doesn't it?
Well,
Jacob's an animal.
I guess this is that's exactly the point I'm trying to make.
And I'm joking, of course, because I last Saturday with RFM called Austin Fife. Someone in the comments pointed out a lying liar who lies. They thought that line was funny.
Yes.
Well,
But I have heard, because they talk about this stuff, like over at Psych Ward Radio. I try not to get there. I don't go there very often. I don't listen to much of what they say. Sometimes their thumbnails will come up and I will see things that reference this kind of stuff. Apparently, they seem to want to have it be Mormon specific, but then when they talk about it more accurately, it's more sort of religious. They go to the religion as opposed to the religion and spiritual to the religious part. And Mormon being a religion, it falls under this umbrella. It's all rather confusing, actually.
It's because they're confused.
Yeah. So really, when you do pin them down, it's not Mormonism that makes gay people better than outside the church. It's any religion makes gay people better than feel better than outside the church. I don't think that would apply to Islam, but who am I to judge?
Well, and
because homosexuality is proscribed in Islam.
Yeah. Well, no, I don't think you would be able to find a scientist or somebody who works even adjacent to this field who would die on the hill of saying, like, look at all my research. It's better for you to be religious because there's some protective factor. Like, you should never leave a religion. I just can't imagine any scientist publishing that. Maybe there are some out there, but they've got to be the minority. And I think something else from the study, and you already pointed this out, RFM, is, why don't religious people very often, why do we see lower levels of suicide or suicidal ideation in these communities? Well, because very often there's strong religious prohibitions against it. They're viewed as violent. You're taught that, you'll be punished in some form in the afterlife. Those are very psychologically motivating reasons to not do those behaviors.
Usually it's hell.
Yes.
You can't even be buried in consecrated ground if you're a suicide. I'm thinking Hamlet, of course. Yeah. But it seems like religion, for the apologists, religion has become the new version of the garment because there's magic protective power in just being a member of a religion.
And they don't seem to realize how fatal that is for their belief in Mormonism. That tells you almost explicitly that it's all made up, that the social benefits are from being part of that group, regardless of what they believe. That it's more
all
about
in the
group.
mind, not in the specific religion.
Right.
No, great points. And I think you can skip actually the next slide and we can just go to the next study. Would somebody just be willing to read this real fast?
I will. Still, under surprising LGBTQ plus findings from the Light on Truth letter. In an older 2002 study, before the recent decade's meteoric rise in LGBTQ plus identification, my observation, anecdotal, Hilton, Fellingham, and Lyon, so another study, found that, quote, higher levels of religiosity appear to be inversely associated with suicide, period. Okay, now this is along the lines of what I always think of with sociology, okay, is that 95% of sociology is when I hear on the radio that there's a new report out, right, based upon this extensive survey that tells us stuff that we've already known since forever, right? It's like there's never anything surprising in sociology. And so rarely. And so when there is something that's surprising, like this is supposed to be surprising, it is first off out of the ordinary. And second off, you got to look at it even closer. So higher levels of religiosity, not Mormonism, like you pointed out, Colby, just religiosity, appear to be inversely associated with suicide. This is like Hamlet. There needs no ghost, my lord, come from the grave to tell us this. This is obvious. Of course, there's going to be less suicide with people who think that committing suicide is a sin.
Yeah, because most religions, the explanation is very clear, because most religions have religious prohibitions against suicide. If we wanted to test it, we could hypothetically think of a religion that advocated for suicide, right? This would be terrible, but I'm saying some weird Star Trek or Black Mirror episode where we have a religion that advocates suicide. In fact, there is a Star Trek Next Generation episode about this. I actually watched it in a BYU class. We would probably expect the exact same result, just flipped. And that, I think, goes to the idea. One other thing I wanted to note, since you commented on Austin's anecdotal observation that LGBTQ identification has gone up since 2002. I just want to note meteorically. I just want to note for listeners, Lawrence v. Texas, the federal Supreme Court case that recognized that states cannot criminalize homosexual behavior between two consenting adults, was in 2003, which is surprising when most people hear that. But that's the reality. Is it was states were allowed to criminalize homosexual behavior, what happens in your private bedroom if it's with another person of the same gender, until 2003 in this country. So
that wasn't covered in Hardwick.
I don't think it completely, because I know Lawrence v. Texas ultimately had to essentially tell states that they cannot criminalize homosexual behavior.
And I don't remember it well enough, but Hardwick I learned about in law school back in the late 80s. So obviously it predated that. But regardless,
I actually don't remember Hardwick, and that's surprising me because usually I have a pretty good memory for case law.
Oh man, I hope I'm right. Okay.
Yeah, no, this is great. I would also, again, just
Bowers v. Hardwick. Oh, no. I'm sorry. It's the opposite. In Bowers versus Hardwick, 1986. So that was new when I was in law school. I started law school in 86.
So that's basically the Plessy versus Ferguson that was overturned by Lawrence v. Texas.
Thank you. The Supreme Court ruled in Bowers v. Hardwick. The Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution does not protect the right of gay adults to engage in private consensual sodomy.
Yeah, and just since I referenced Plessy v. Ferguson, and I don't want it to be too inside baseball, I'll just spend 1 second. Plessy v. Ferguson is the federal Supreme Court decision that recognized separate but equal is allowable, basically under the law. It's what led to segregation and allowed for Jim Crow laws, and it was
overturned by
Brown versus Board of Education in 1954.
Separate is inherently unequal.
Yep.
Boom. Thank you so much. You should do a podcast about the law.
I have Yes, I should.
And he's doing one. He's going to do one. It's going to be great. I have
the first episode filmed. I just haven't released it.
I think I'm ready to take the bar exam after that conversation. I think.
Yeah, you would think so. But by the third day, you'd think, I need to know a little bit more.
Yeah, I can imagine that is very true.
Next slide.
Yeah, perfect. And honestly, I think we've summed up. This study also doesn't focus on the LGBT community, probably largely because of what Colby just said. And I think that just about covers it. We can go to when he starts talking about Tyler Lefevor.
Can I ask you a question? Because it's been a while since I did my bio degree. That slide that you had up talked about a meta-analysis. Can you just explain what the difference between a meta-analysis and a study is? Mostly for my remembering, but also for the audience, because there's a significant difference between those, correct?
Yeah, there is. And hopefully I'll be able to represent them okay. If you can think about, typically when we think of a research study, you think about a scientist studying, in our case, for what we're talking about today, like a specific group of people at a specific group of time reporting, self-reported data. A meta-analysis is researchers combing through like a ton of different studies and all adding them into one giant analysis of each of these studies and saying, look, okay, now we have a bunch of information on this studied group or this studied thing. Let's try and synthesize what we know into this one analysis so we can draw one more unified understanding of whatever we're studying.
Thank you for that. And so if Mormonism was really, true in the sense that I think it purports to be, and it really did have the best result for people in the LGBT community, what we might expect when they're doing this meta-analysis of these 63 studies is those researchers saying something like, we looked at all these studies, and while we found an overall positive effect here, this protective effect against suicidal ideation for all religious people, outlier of outliers, we found that these studies involving Mormons showed an even greater protective effect. Is that right? Would that be more in line with the way Austin Fife, I think, kind of represents this data, or am I being uncharitable?
No, I think that that's what would show in a meta-analysis. This is kind of an older meta-analysis, I think, in 2002. Is that what they said? And
yeah.
But I would agree.
Okay.
Okay, now I'm confused. Would you agree that it would say that Mormons are more protective, or that's correct, or that's a misrepresentation?
No, I would say that Mormons aren't more protected or have better physical. The meta-analysis wouldn't say anything like that. If there is a protective religious effect, that would just extend across all religions. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Colton? I was asking hypothetically if the way Austin wanted people to understand this data was really what the data said. That's what we would expect. We would expect these researchers to say, wow, this is a wonder. We found not only was there a protective effect against suicidal ideation for all religious people, but lo and behold, Mormons actually had double the protective effect or 3 times the protective effect. It would be some outlier, I think, if Mormonism were true the way it purports to be. That was what I was trying to get at, RFM, but it was inartfully asked.
Well, that's okay. I just wanted to make sure I was following things. And going to the next slide.
And there's just some more commentary. I think the two more slides so we can get to the next.
Another one?
Yep, one more.
Okay. By the way, we're skipping these because Jacob feels like we've already gone over the contents of them as we've been discussing it.
Yeah, I do. And this is just to show that this 2017 study, it also can't be generalizable to the community that we're trying to focus on in this chapter of the Light and Truth Letter, because it doesn't focus on the LGBT community. You can't quote a research study that's not about that community to try and use it to support what you're saying about that community. That's the apples and oranges conversation that we are having.
So this Harvard research study, we want to get Harvard in there because it's a big name. It's from 2017, so pretty recent, and it has to do with suicide rates and religiosity or religious attendance, but it has nothing to do with LGBTQ people.
Yeah.
That's the point you're making?
Yeah, and there's probably a really good conversation to be had about this research, but you can't just throw it in to support your interpretation on how it affects LGBT people if it's not about LGBT people. So,
yeah, and I would say that if people are going to be not committing suicide when they otherwise might because they're a member of a religion that has a proscription against it and bad eternal consequences as a result, you'll probably be less likely to commit suicide within a religion like that than you will if you stop attending a religion like that.
Yeah, because it's generalized. It kind of reminds me, in other words, because it's not specific to the LGBTQ community, like Jacob has highlighted, it reminds me of our kind of recurring joke with Austin. Like, you will have LGBTQ plus relevant data in your LGBTQ plus chapter, right?
Right, exactly.
Part quote.
Yeah, I love that quote. And you're the one who keeps reminding me of it. Without you, I wouldn't remember it. That's the one where he says you will have dinosaurs on your dinosaur
tour. Yeah.
Won't you?
Jeff Goldblum is a treasure.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so going to the next slide.
Perfect. And this is it's a news article with Dr. Goodman. We've heard his name a couple times. He pumps out a lot of research as far as I can identify.
This was in the Deseret News, where Jacob Hess writes for the Deseret News. Who owns the Deseret News, Jacob?
Well, man, can I remember the full name? The president of the Corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and all.
That's the full name. There's a song about that. It goes, I belong to the Corporation of the President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I know who I am.
Yeah.
Proprietorship.
Something.
He's all those in there.
Is that right? But yeah, I mean, the Deseret News obviously owned by the Mormon Church. And so, of course, they're going to put some news articles out there into the world that say, hey, gay people are really blessed by being Mormon and trying to not live their authentic lifestyle, I guess.
The most significant thing I see on this slide is he has under that second data point or bullet point, he says the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, found that from 2011 through 2015, Latter-day Saint youth, so that's not specific to LGBT, but just this is where we're actually looking at something specific to Mormonism, had a lower risk of suicide. Do you want to speak to that, or did I skip over something relevant in the first bullet point, Jacob?
No, I don't think so. And that's the main point, again, that I wanted to hit with the CDC study is, and we've been emphasizing this a lot, Latter-day Saint youth, probably hear a lot of prohibitions on suicide, but this study is not about the LGBT youth within the Mormon context, so you can't use that to support this goal. It shouldn't be here.
Can I read the data in that first bullet point, because it's actually very interesting to me. So it says, so this is from that Deseret News article sharing the following data from their study. This was written in 2019. It says 44% of Utah's Latter-day Saint LGBTQ plus identifying youths had seriously considered suicide, compared to 47% of Utah's LGBTQ plus identifying youths from other religions. I'm going to pause there and just say, I don't know what the standard deviation or the confidence interval involved is, but I can't imagine it's much smaller than 3%. So that seems like a negligible difference to me between Mormon and non-Mormon, looking at falling within the LGBT community.
I think that's why they called it a small difference, a small increase in the actual study before, which is different from what the this article in the Light on News, this chapter, is trying to get across to us. But I think you're right; it's very small.
And if we look, then I'm going to skip over the rest of that study for now and read the last sentence in that first bullet point. It says
very small, Colby. By the way, very small, and also restricted to Utah.
Right, and then it says the national rate for LGB youth is 47.7. So we're already not comparing apples to apples, because the trans community is left off that second data point. It's just LGB. But if we're looking at it and doing the comparison, we've got 44 of Mormon LGBT youth, 47% of Utah non-Mormon religious LGBT youth, and the national rate is 47%. That seems more or less consistent to me. Then 77% of Utah's non-Mormon or non-religious LGBT identifying youth seriously considered suicide. Again, as I'm just looking at that data, what that suggests to me is being part of a community, a religious community in Utah, is the protective effect, not what that religious community is. It actually, I think, isn't really making the point that Austin wants to make, even if we accept the data, even if we accept the apples to oranges comparison he does in the last sentence. Is there anything in there, Jacob, that I'm wrong about?
A little bit, and I think you'll laugh at the reason why. And it's because if you go to the Deseret News article and try to pull up the research reference in the news article, there's no research. It's just an opinion thrown in the Deseret News article. This isn't science. This is opinion. If you actually go to the Deseret News article, and that's what I say in my commentary.
But are these percentages opinion too?
As far as I can tell, because if I click on the research that has those statistics within the Deseret News article, it doesn't pull up a website. The website's broken, or the research was never published.
Okay. So
when he
here
says they
on in the letter, it has a footnote 9 at the end of the first bullet point. That just takes you to the Deseret News article?
Yes.
And the Deseret News article takes you to no research to support this.
This Deseret News article, if I remember correctly, quotes a lot of research, but this specific research with these specific numbers doesn't take you to any research. So
it would seem those numbers would be like the most important point of the article.
Yeah, I would agree, but there's nothing there.
Okay.
And then that article ends by basically saying Michael Goodman's a professor of religion at Brigham Young University. So is Dr. Dyer. They're researchers on the Family Foundations of Youth Development Study, and their views are their own. So I don't know how to take that if there's no actual research being quoted.
So the way Austin represents this is this Deseret News article is them sharing data, these statistics that we just kind of talked about from their study. That's the way Austin represents it. As I go to the actual Deseret News article and I'm clicking at links, none of these studies are done. You're right. There are links that are broken to the CDC's website. There is one link that goes to a Swedish study entitled Suicide in Married Couples in Sweden. Is the risk greater in same-sex couples? So already, this isn't their study. This is their opinion by looking at data from different countries. This is very...
Well, does the Swedish survey deal with Utah-specific individuals?
No. Well, I can't imagine that scientists in Sweden care one bit about what's going on in Utah.
Good point.
Well, curiouser and curiouser as we go on.
Yeah.
And
See,
no,
this is one of the problems that we see over and over again in the Light on Truth letter is
And just-
an unfamiliarity with the sources that they're citing, that Austin is citing.
And just to close the loop on that, I'm looking at the abstract of the paper. They are using Sweden's extensive linked databases for their data. So unsurprisingly, I think the Swedish scientists that are being quoted for statistics in this Deseret News piece are looking at statistics in Sweden, not anything to do with Utah.
Well, this is getting very confusing.
Yeah, it
So
was.
much confusion.
But God is not the author of confusion, or something like that.
Well, Austin 5 sure as hell is.
Oh, that's the majority, the commentary. I think we can move to the next slide.
All right.
Unless there's anything else you wanted to bring up there.
No.
Okay, so yeah, let me look. Okay, so Walter Schum reports in the 2019 Utah Prevention Needs Assessment Survey suggests that Latter-day Saint LGBTQ youth had lower levels of reported depression and suicidality than non-religious youth. And then let's jump, if you don't mind, jumping to the commentary real fast.
Yes, and by the way, I know you're reading from the Light and Truth letter.
Oh, yes.
Were those, it says a 2019 Utah Prevention. You're cueing me in. What you're doing, Jacob, by your analysis of this is that we have to look carefully at every word.
Absolutely.
That this is very, very important. Every word here is important. And the 2019 Utah Prevention Needs Assessment Survey, it would have to do with Utah people, right? Utah Latter-day Saint LGBTQ youth, right?
Yeah.
And Utah non-religious LGBTQ youth.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think there's even some. Sorry, go for it.
I'm presuming that's the case because what I'm noting is that the letter doesn't say that. The letter doesn't restrict or clarify that these are Utah individuals that are being surveyed.
I think actually this. I'm looking at my commentary, and it talks about a forthcoming analysis in Utah.
Is this the next slide?
Let me pause
here?
you, Jacob. I think this is the point that RFM's making. Go back one slide, RFM.
Yeah.
The point you're making is that the data that he's talking about from this Walter Schum guy says 2019 Utah Prevention Needs Assessment Survey. He then shares data from the Utah's Student Health and Risk Prevention statewide survey. But the point that Austin's drawing from this data is not Utah specific, it's Mormon specific. He says this data suggests that Latter-day Saint LGB youth had lower levels of reported depression and suicidality, there we go, than non-religious LGB youths. And the point RFM is making, I think, is Austin is taking data in Utah, completely ignoring the effect that Utah in Mormonism, or in Utah, Mormonism is the dominant religion, and saying we can apply what we learned from Utah to all Mormon youth. And that is the logical fallacy, by the way, of composition and division. To take a lesson from one, this is the problem with anecdotal experience too, is we take a lesson from one set of data and we extrapolate it out to the whole in a way that isn't appropriate. We can't reach that conclusion. It might actually be correct, right? Because the fact that it's fallacious reasoning doesn't mean it's automatically incorrect. It means that it can't lead us to a true conclusion through that line of reasoning.
Yeah.
Is that the point you were trying to make, RFM?
Or at least a valid conclusion. But yes, that's exactly the point I was trying to make.
Okay.
Well, and I don't know if you're able to look at this again, but in my commentary, I point out a few things. He throws a lot of references at you, but actually just references 11, 12, and 13 are all the same reference.
Hang on. 11, 12, and 13. So there's 11, these footnote 12, and there's footnote 13. I see them all. But what you're saying is those are all to the same Deseret News article.
Those are all to the same Deseret News article, which I guess is how you reference them. It just kind of feels like a gish gallop of references, if I was to use.
It's what it looks like, but it's not even that. It's the same freaking reference used over and over again. instead of saying everything you have to say and then citing to it once.
That's also very lazy, because the Deseret News article does talk about this this data from Schum, but suggestion to Austin: if you're talking about the data from Schum, go cite to the data from Schum, not a news article that's talking about the data from Schum.
Well, and I think that's where it runs into the problem, because when I tried to pull up that research, it's not there.
Yeah. All I could find when I was clicking on those links just a second ago, since we were talking about that Deseret News article, is a link to that book. But there's no way that I can access it at all.
Yeah.
It's just a link to purchase the book, basically.
So maybe it is there and I didn't dig deep enough, but I couldn't find anything online while I was searching that actually backed up the statement that being a Latter-day Saint is protective against depression and suicidality, even for LGBTQ students.
And this is important, okay? This is very important, because what we're saying here and what you're saying, Jacob, the most important point that Austin Fife and the other apologists are trying to make is that LGBTQ people are better off mentally, physically inside the LDS church than they are outside the LDS church. And what you're telling us is that your research failed to disclose, even using their own sources and trying to follow and find out where they got this from, is failing to disclose or find a report that says any such thing.
There are a few BYU articles that would agree with what you just said, that LGBT youth are better off in the church living a Orthodox Mormon lifestyle.
In Utah, though. In Utah.
Right. And I think they're students who go to BYU, they're active LDS and part of the LGBT community. And so
pretty soon the LGBT students aren't going to be able to go to BYU. So that problem will solve itself, I guess, if Clark Gilbert gets his way.
Yep, exactly. And so there are some studies out there that say that, but they are in the vast minority.
Right.
Are there any studies that were conducted by non-Mormons that reached that conclusion?
No, not that I could find.
So only the Mormons who do the studies reach this conclusion.
Yeah, and I think that's something important to keep in mind. I don't think you should just throw the study out, but it's important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, right, and I think even more than the potential for bias, I really think this qualification of these are studies looking at the situation in Utah is very important, because that's the most important caveat, even more to me at least than the potential for bias, is we're talking about the situation in Utah. If you want to make the case about general Mormonism, the way that Austin is and the way, as RFM's referenced, apologists constantly do, these studies can't lead to that conclusion, and they need to be more careful about how they're talking about this data, or they need to do, or have someone do, additional studies to be able to make that case. I'm going to suggest one reason they haven't done those additional studies is because, as we've already talked about, the more generalized studies are indicating that that protective effect happens regardless of which religion you're part of. So I would suspect if we actually did that comparison, it would not reach the conclusion that the apologists and Austin Fife specifically are saying that this data reaches.
Just one of the many reasons I'm glad to have you on the show, Colby. Excellent, excellent point. You've got some writing here in red, Jacob. Did you want to talk about that on the slide?
And that is just a quote from the Deseret News article to the research that he references that I don't have access to. That, as far as I could find, doesn't exist unless it's in that book that Colby.
That's where those statistics we looked at on the previous page are supposedly coming from.
Okay. So it's got to be in that book that I don't have the money to purchase.
Well, do you read Swedish?
Not yet.
This is the Utah. This is the Utah.
Sorry, what, Colby?
This is the Utah data, actually. So this is for folks who are sitting there going, this is a little confused. This is analysis. The reason we've hit this point a few times when we start digging into Austin's work is because his analysis is confused. This response is a response to Austin's work, and that's one of the reasons sometimes we run into this, where it's so unclear what he's talking about that it's difficult for us to talk about. I used the phrase once before, fractally wrong. It takes a lot of time to correct someone who's like wrong right from the get-go.
Right. And it's like he's throwing in everything into the kitchen sink. He's giving the impression, I think, of doing his own meta-analysis of all these different studies. But like you said, Jacob, when you actually look at the studies, there's only, was it 2 or 3 that have to do with the issue? And there's a bunch of news articles, and all the rest of the studies he cites too don't even have to do with the issue he's purporting to address.
Yep, there's only 2 articles as that actually support his interpretation.
And those are the 2 by the BYU professors, Mr.
Yes.
Goodman.
Dr. Goodman, and I guess you could throw in a third if you include Dr. Cranny's report that we talked about at the very beginning.
I like Cranny. Let's call him Cranny.
Cranny. Okay.
All right.
Okay, I know that we have only about 20 minutes left, and we have a ton of slides. For
You can take 25.
Okay.
You can take longer than that for me.
And you can take longer than that. It's okay, Jacob. You probably have to get to some sort of dissection.
On Monday I will, actually.
Really? What are you going to dissect?
What's that?
What are you going to dissect on Monday?
I'm currently in a neuro course, and we are looking at things in the neck. So I get
in the neck?
Dissect the neck. Yep.
Whose neck?
A donor, a very gracious person who's willing to donate themselves for medical students to study.
Do you ever, since you said it's a neuro course?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. When you get to studying the brain, will you let me know which part of the brain I have to eviscerate for me to find the selective witness model convincing?
Yeah. If I ever find that, I'll let you know. For sure.
I think it's typically found in the frontal cortex, the frontal lobe right up here.
That sounds.
If you get rid of that, then you will find the collective witness model absolutely convincing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Usually it's only people who've had lobotomies that find that convincing.
If you drink enough, you might be able to.
Oh,
to the point you're not able to read as well.
You sound like a man who knows what he's talking about as he takes a swig.
Maybe. Yeah. Who knows? Who knows what's in this bottle? No. So I think if we could go to the next surprising LGBT findings, this is interesting. I know this is one of the things that Fife updated. He quotes this doctor a lot, Dr. Lefevor, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and he just misrepresents his position all the time. You'll see. So he quotes research by Dr. Lefevor here, and he also quotes a news article where Dr. Lefevor is talking about his research, and that's what this quote is in the middle of the screen. Would somebody
read this as a lead up?
Yeah.
Tyler Lefevor, an associate professor of clinical counseling specialization at Utah State University, was the lead researcher for a study published in May of 2023 regarding sexual minority Mormons. Lefevor, a former Latter-day Saint, admitted, see, if they're former Latter-day Saints, they're admitting it, admitted that he was surprised by the findings. He said, quote, "I always think that as people become less religious, they're going to be happier. That's just what I expect to see every single time. And I shouldn't expect that anymore because it's been several years that I've been not finding that." Period. End of quote. Now, this is the quote where you talked to Austin, and you said, there's another line that goes after that for fairness sake, you should include in your quote from Tyler Lefevor. Can you tell us about that, Jacob?
Yes, absolutely. And I think we should read what that following sentence is. And if you go to the next slide, it'll appear on the screen. So RFM, would you read what the second sentence says, or the last sentence? Oh, I think you're muted.
I just want to give you a chance to say that.
Yeah.
You can mark this on your calendar. So this is a continuation of that same quote from Tyler Lefevor. This data goes well with other data that I've gathered in the last few years that really highlight religiousness as both a good and bad thing for sexual minorities.
Okay, so I want to make sure I understand this. So, Jacob, you provided this feedback to Austin directly that he, in this original, in the original quotation, he removed this final sentence. You pointed out to him how deceptive and misleading that was, and he since corrected it. Is that, I understand the situation correctly?
That's correct. Yeah. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see a little exchange that I had with him. after he made his recent Reddit post on our Mormon, and I said, hey, is this because of my correction? He said, probably. I don't specifically recall who drew my attention to that. I agree that Lefevor is better represented with the full statement. I said, thank you. But that's correct. When he first published the book, he left that, I would say, very important qualifying sentence off. And he since added it online.
So good on Austin for correcting it. I'm also at the same time going to push back a little bit and say it's still very concerning to me that he was willing to write the first draft by cutting out the sentence that undercut the conclusion he's reaching in this overall chapter. And while I am always supportive of people changing things, I also want to make the point that people need to think about the strategy that Austin went into writing this entire book with from the get-go, which is exactly like RFM and I have highlighted over and over again, being very misleading and being very willing to be misleading if it's in furtherance of the conclusion he wants to reach. So good on him for correcting it, but I'm still going to say I don't trust someone who would engage in this type of behavior from the get-go. Is that unfair, RFM?
No, it's not unfair. Now, if he's just making mistakes, right? If he's just sort of negligent, he doesn't know what he's doing, one would normally expect that mistakes would fall on an average of 50-50 on both sides of the equation, on both sides of the issue. He'd get around 50% of his mistakes that make the church look better and 50% of the church that makes the church, 50% of his mistakes that make the church look worse, right? The problem is, of course, that that's not what happens. 100% of his mistakes make the church look better.
Yeah.
And when 100% of your mistakes make the church look better, they start looking less like mistakes.
Yeah. In other words, if that last sentence, which was added because of Jacob, congratulations, by the way, Jacob, you are responsible for changes in the Light and Truth letter, just like RFM and I are. But if it would have read, the data goes well with other data I've gathered in the last few years that really highlight religiousness as a good thing for sexual minorities and not good and bad thing, you can bet your ass that it would have been in there in the first edition because it supported his conclusion. And that's the point I'm making is I'm not trying to be unduly mean to Jacob or to Austin. I'm just highlighting that I don't trust his methodology because, and I don't even know if it's willful or intentional at this point. I talked about that a little bit last night with RFM and Bill. To me, it doesn't matter if this is the thing that Austin thinks is valid research and a valid way to make arguments. I'm still very concerned, even if he's corrected the issue. Sorry to belabor that point, but.
And this next slide, this was the only point, I referenced it on last night's Mormonism After Dark, that this was the second time that Austin put up his post at Reddit the last few days, Mormon Reddit.
This is a different post, I think.
I think this isn't this from the second post?
It's in the comments of the second post.
Because I read it. This was the only time that I saw that Austin made any comment other than the opening post. The first time before he took it down, he didn't comment on anybody. He didn't respond to anybody's comments or criticisms or questions. And here's the only time he did it on the second post, at least as of yesterday when I last looked at it. And that's not really much of a response to the questions, but it's something. Baby steps down the street, Austin. We want to encourage you.
Yeah, I feel special.
I did specifically request that he would answer my question, if any, and he didn't, I see. So.
Oh,
good for you,
Jacob. Kind of jealous of
Jacob
now.
I hope you like my.
You're kind of jealous of Jacob now. Austin will respond to his question, but not to you.
I can tell, Jacob, you were going to ask me about your screen name. Yes, I like it. It's Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics.
Beautiful.
I thought that was the father of Barbara Mendel. Or is that Mandrell? Anyway.
Yeah, father of modern genetics.
Father of physics. See, I don't know this stuff.
Genetics.
You guys are so smart. You guys are nerds.
Yes. Okay. I'm glad you liked it and recognize it. And I think a really important point, if Austin Fife is going to be fair in this section, how is religion, according to this researcher, according to Dr. Lefevor, how is religion both good and bad? And if you go to the next slide, he explains.
Something that's very obvious just occurred to me, that this whole nerd thing, this is what dumb people call smart people in order to justify being dumb. Nerds. All right, next slide.
I love it.
Just to put a point on that, one of my favorite shows is Rick and Morty, and Rick Sanchez, the interdimensional traveler, at one point says, when he's booed by a crowd of people, he says, "Your boos mean nothing to me. I've seen what makes you cheer." So to go, I wear nerd as a badge of honor.
I think I watch Rick and Morty more than read the Book of Mormon nowadays, if I'm being honest.
All right. I think we've identified the problem, Jacob.
Oh, that's what it is.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
I'm
RFM,
clipping
you
this
saved
and
my
sending it
just
to your
moment.
bishop. Or if I'm not,
Jacob
somebody is.
Jacob Hansen already took care of that.
Oh,
Don't
totally.
worry.
He'll go right to your stake president.
So how is religion both a good and a bad thing, according to this researcher? And it says right here in red, service attendance. So these are Mormons who are part of the LGBT community. Service attendance was related to lower levels of meaning in life and higher levels of depression at the time, while interpersonal religious commitment at baseline was related to higher levels of meaning in life and lower levels of depression. So basically what he's saying here is if you are LGBT and LDS, if you are actively going to church and trying to do those things, according to him, your mental health will take a dive. But the relationships that you make with people in your ward and at community events and things like that, those are what benefit you, which really isn't that surprising if you think critically about this situation.
Okay.
This is the same
I'm still
point.
trying to get over the fact that he apparently used ellipses in such a way as to reverse the meaning of the study, because it says service attendance was related to lower levels of meaning in life. Surely what leads up to service attendance is lower levels of service attendance was related to lower levels of meaning in life, right?
No, I think this is from the study. This is what Jacob pulled from the study, not Austin, to make the point that this is what the researcher actually says. So you're right. You're right.
This is what's really in the study. This isn't what Austin quoted.
No.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So that is correct. Service attendance was related to lower levels of meaning in life and higher levels of depressions at times. So even if you're going to church, it's related to lower levels of meaning in life.
It's exactly like we've been talking about. It's the community aspect of religion that often people find in religion. That's what this researcher is finding. The interpersonal religious commitment at baseline was related to the higher levels of meaning. It's having a community, regardless of what that community is, that helps. And this is what Jacob's saying is the bad effect of religion, because he said it has both good and bad effects. So the good is that it's the interpersonal connections that you have. The bad effect is actually going to church. And Austin is using that to say, look at how Mormonism has this protective effect for LGBT youth, when really it's having a solid community, if we're looking at what this researcher has found and concluded at least, not religion itself. Religion itself actually has the exact inverse effect. Is that right, Jacob? Am I understanding you?
Perfect.
Incredible. I'm glad I misunderstood this, because now I understand it even better. And I think that whereas a lot of people out there probably got it right the first time, unlike me, I'm sure that not everybody did. So hopefully that really clarifies it. This seems like a really important point.
It is. And if this blew your mind, let's go to his next point. Keep going.
You've blown my mind so many times that Jacob Hansen makes a lot of sense
And then let's go one more after that. And then would one of you read this?
Colby?
Yep. It appears that the risk of suicidal thought, and this is from the Light and Truth letter, it appears that the risk of suicidal thoughts is nearly double for those of no religion versus Latter-day Saints for both LGBTQ identifying and heterosexual students in Utah. Might that mean that the Church of Jesus Christ, I hate when they do this, may that mean that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints may be protective somehow? If you're going to hold us to it being an insult that to say Mormon Church, how dare you say Church of Jesus Christ? Like, if you are going to die on this molehill of use the correct name of the church, then you need to do it too. Why is the risk of suicidal ideation lower for Latter-day Saint youth in Utah if they are also more likely to be bullied for their religious affiliation, according to the 2019 Sharp survey?
So the first.
Okay, now Jacob, I know you're going to comment on this, but I want to comment on the fact that here he's actually trying to get back to that original quote from Twitter. All right.
Oh, good point.
Where it says that LGBTQ people or youth are more bullied in Utah. So here's virtual hugs. And here he's saying that according to a 2019 SHARP survey, which I'm sure stands for something wonderful, might that mean the Church of Jesus Christ may be protective somehow? Why, he asks, is the risk of suicide ideation lower for Latter-day Saint youth in Utah if they are also more likely to be bullied for their religious affiliation, according to the 2019 SHARP survey? Your response.
So if we go to the commentary, I just quickly point out that his link is initially to a Deseret News article again. And so if you want to just go, like, if the listeners want to look this up and see what I have to comment about that article, they can look this up. But if we go to the SHARP survey, and if you go to the next slide, I'll just show you how I accessed the 2019 Utah state, regional, and demographic reports of the SHARP survey, and I pull up the statewide report in 2019. And if you go to the next slide, so we're going to look at pages. Yes, Colby?
What does SHARP stand for? Is it that student harm?
I don't know off the top of my head.
I think I'll look it up. Keep going. Sorry.
Okay. So this is the results of the statewide survey. The most important slide, actually, though, is the next one. Perfect. Okay, so there was no link when Austin said that Latter-day Saint youth are more likely to be bullied because of their religious affiliation. Kind of left that up to me to dig into. Does the SHARP survey say that? Mm-hmm. Well, does the SHARP survey measure how many students are Mormon or LDS or identifies Latter-day Saints? No, none of that. The qualifiers they have, the labels they have that students reported, their perceived reasons for bullying are all on this list on the very left. There's no, the religious category they have is I felt bullied because of my religion, not I felt bullied because I was Mormon or anything adjacent to that. And then they also have some other things on here, right? And out of 31,400 students surveyed, 12 said that they felt like their religion felt like it played a part in the reason that they were bullied. So if you just go to the next slide.
Is that a percentage? Because it's 12.2.
If you have been bullied. Oh, it might be a percentage. Okay, thank you.
Okay, and I was going to ask, if this is in Utah, is it perhaps more likely that anybody who feels like they're being bullied because of their religion would be non-Mormon?
That's a possibility. And that's basically what I say in the next slide, is that the 2019 Utah SHARP survey does not state that suicidal ideation is lower for Latter-day Saint in Utah, and does not say that they're more likely to be bullied for their religious affiliation, because those aren't even things measured by the 2019 SHARP survey. So there's no reason to reach that conclusion.
So once again, Austin Fife is misrepresenting his sources.
Yes.
I was sitting here thinking, like, that doesn't make, like, just the conclusion doesn't make any sense to us, to me. That's where we have to think for just 1 second. Like, does it make sense that the majority religion in Utah is going to report being bullied for their religious affiliation? That's what Austin Representative is saying, is that Utah Mormon kids are bullied for their religion. But I was sitting there thinking, that doesn't make any sense. And that's what you're saying, right?
Exactly.
He's taking general data that was collected in Utah for, I've been bullied for my religion, and then saying that that's like a specifically Mormon. I'm not saying it's never happened in Utah to a Mormon kid, but he's taking statewide data, making the same error of composition and division. He's taking the data that applies to the whole and applying it to his specific group in a way that isn't warranted by that data. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And this could be anybody of any religion, like you're pointing out, and I'm just belaboring the point. They could be Seventh-day Adventist, Christian, Buddhist, Jewish. It could be any religion.
And there's also my gender and my sexual orientation highlighted on this slide.
Yeah, because I feel like those two things apply to LGBT findings more than the rest of what is talked about in this chapter of Fife's letter. So I just highlighted those as well.
So for my gender, 7.6% I believe respond, as yes, they get bullied for their gender. For my sexual orientation, 6.7 respond that they answers yes, but 12.2 for my religion. That is a little less than both of those put together for my gender and my sexual orientation.
That would be correct.
What's the significance of that, if any?
Well, I mean, somebody's gender and sexual, so the same people could be responding to both. So it might be less than my religion, right? But I think it's just important to acknowledge and remember that people of sexual minorities are being bullied because of their gender and their sexual orientation. That's just a fact. That happens. We need to do, everybody, Mormon, non-Mormon, needs to do a better job at making sure that doesn't happen. That's why I highlighted those.
Okay. And there's your commentary, going back to the Light on Truth letter.
Okay, and a lot of what follows in the Light on Truth letter is what we're about to get into, and I'll just read what.
No, wait a second, Jacob. Colby wants to read this. I can tell by the look on his face.
I was actually chuckling at Jacob saying "Light on Truth" letter for the first time. How do the critics in good conscience? How do the critics in good conscience make blanket recommendations to LGBT identifying individuals to leave the church and their families if the likelihood for worse outcomes is higher if they do that? Before either of you answer, I'll just say, hey, RFM, as someone who's been specifically exempted from being a critic under the new definition of the Light and Truth letter, but I'll ask you the question anyways. Have you ever made a blanket recommendation that LGBT, or anyone for that matter, a blanket recommendation that those individuals leave the church and their families? Have you ever made that recommendation?
I would like to say it was intentional, but it was only serendipity that I mentioned that with Jacob in the phone call I had with him last night. Because I did not suggest that he leave the church or that he take any specific action as a result of his faith journey. I just said, lots of luck, pal. But
That's right. That's right.
And also, especially, I don't suggest anybody leave the church, no matter who they are or what their orientation is or how they identify. And I certainly don't suggest that they leave their families. That's what he says here. How do the critics make, he says the critics make blanket recommendations to LGBTQ plus people to leave their families.
Yep. And the point I'm making with this, and I won't go any further than this, is just I want people to notice the tactic that's being employed here. This isn't written to the Light and Truth letter is not written to critics. I will continue to call this out. This is a dishonest tactic that Austin uses and hasn't fixed in the second edition, and I will keep hammering him on this until he changes it. This is a polemic written to convince the already convinced, because I also have never recommended any single person I've talked to, which at this point is like hundreds. I know I don't have a platform and I'm a rando on the internet, but the number of people who've reached out to me when they're in the middle of their faith crisis, the two pieces of advice I always give people is take your time and don't feel like you have to reach a quick conclusion. It is a journey, and it is an individual journey. You have to decide how you want to weigh your principles and your values, and take time and reach out if you ever need help or someone to listen, or if you need resources. But I have never, and I don't know really any critics of the church who make the blanket recommendation for how other people live their life. What I'm absolutely sure of is that there are 15 men and a bunch of sorry apologists who apologize for what those 15 men do, who do make blanket recommendations for how other people live their life, LGBTQ plus identifying or not. They do that. And I want to just point that out, that this is my point, is this is not written to legitimate critics of the church. If it was, he would have quotes from the critics that he's talking about that aren't just, some straw man he snipped off of social media. He would be addressing someone. Yeah, he would be addressing someone specifically who's actually done what he accuses critics have done. He never does that. And that's because this isn't a letter written to critics of the church. It's written to this imaginary critic that he wants the already convinced to believe about ex-Mormons. I actually think that is the prime motivator of this letter, is to poison the well in believing Mormons' minds of critics of the church.
Yes, he's painting the non-believer as a boogeyman. And frankly, this question is objectionable. Going all lawyer on you, but it's objectionable. It's a leading question. Not only is it a leading question, it also falls into that subcategory. It's a misleading question. Mm-hmm. It smuggles the conclusion into the question without ever proving the conclusion that they've smuggled in. And so it's a misleading question. It's obviously objectionable. The judge would sustain the objection, and he'd have to go on to some other dumb question, right? Or hopefully a question that's not as leading or misleading.
Mhm.
But honestly, what he's saying here is that critics try and get LGBTQ people to leave their families. What
Yeah,
are you
and he
thinking,
smuggles in.
Austin? Do you think
he-
that's really true?
He
Do you
smuggled
really
in.
think that we ask people to leave their families? Why are you trying to smuggle that into your question in your Light on Truth letter? And how do you feel about it now that we're exposing it?
Yeah, and that's the first conclusion that he smuggles into his question. And you're absolutely right. It is kind of despicable that he thinks that that's what people are doing. If you're going to make that accusation, actually prove it. But the second conclusion he smuggles into the premises is that there actually are worse outcomes if that were the recommendation, which, as Jacob has just walked us through, is not what the scientific evidence says. And if they want to have a conversation about scientific evidence, then Austin needs to make himself more scientifically literate so that he understands what conclusions are actually warranted by the data he's talking about.
Yeah, this is the classic when did you stop beating your wife question.
Exactly.
So he's also saying about this, the outcomes for LGBTQ people are higher. Good outcomes are higher in the church than outside of the church. This is the thing that's making the rounds now. This is why we're doing the episode, because more and more this canard is being bruited about as God's truth.
Yeah. No, I think you summed up my thoughts on this very well. I think I would love, please, Austin, if you have a clip of RFM or John Dehlin or any of the big critics that you call out making blanket recommendations for these people to leave their families in the church, share, because I cannot find one. That's
If
just,
you can find, in line with your challenge, Jacob, if Austin could find a quote that even comes close to the level of othering of Russell M. Nelson saying that believing individuals should not consult or take counsel from unbelievers, if they can find an analogous quote on our side, I would love to see it, because I've never seen anything even close to that level of insulation, of infantilization. And so it's when I see stuff like this in the Light and Truth letter, it really makes me feel like Austin has completely lost the plot on the discussion that we're having. It's just projection is what it seems like to me.
Yeah, the simplified form for me is, as a Mormon, I was told to read only this half of the history and this half of the information. Now that I'm more post-Mormon, certainly, my response is read it all. It's not just read this half over here. Read it all. Get informed. Find out everything you can on both sides of the issue, and then make your best call. And my experience has been it's not even a close call.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that we, contrasted with apologists, we are spending great lengths to go through what Austin actually says in the Light and Truth letter, display it on the screen, read it out loud. The apologists never do that type of behavior. They never want to have that level of conversation in detail, actually going through what critics have said. The only person I know of who does that is Stephen Murphy with Mormonism with the Murph, to his credit.
Very good. I'm glad you called that out. No, they just want to skip stones across the surface of the lake and then drive back home as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
Next slide.
Yeah. How much more time do we have left?
Oh, we've got ages and ages.
I
Don't
have no
worry about
cutoff.
it, Jacob. This
have
is
no
important stuff.
I don't have a cutoff either, but I just
don't have a cutoff. You're good.
Okay.
So Monday morning.
That's right. And
This is Saturday morning, by the way, for everybody. We're recording this in the morning of Saturday, January 25th, 2025.
And if it goes till Monday morning and we find RFM chopped up in his freezer, it was Cami Reddish, I can tell you.
Great episode. Thank you for providing that. So this commentary slide is everything that we just talked about. I think we can move on to the next one.
Okay.
And who would like to read this slide?
I would.
Okay.
Okay. Once again, from the CES letter. Admittedly,
Light and
Austin
Truth
says,
letter.
What?
Light and Truth letter. You said CES
There's
letter.
too many letters floating around.
Too many.
I'm sorry. I do that. Okay, the Light on Truth letter. Thank you for correcting me. Austin says, admittedly, the relationship between LGBTQ plus identifying Latter-day Saints and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is complicated. Well, that's a nice way of saying they're second-class citizens. More research needs to be done so that we can find out that they're not really second-class citizens when they are. As a church, I hope we can be welcoming and compassionate. Why is he hoping this? Because he knows they're not. Okay, let's be honest here, Austin. You wouldn't write that unless you already knew that the church is not welcoming and not compassionate toward those struggling. But he says, as a church, I hope we can be welcoming and compassionate toward those struggling. By the way, they're not struggling, Austin. They're only struggling because of people like you in the LDS church and the things that the LDS church teaches about LGBTQ plus people. That's why they're struggling. They're not struggling because of who they are. They're struggling because of who the church teaches that they are, I think.
Mm-hmm.
He goes on, in the meantime, until we stop, being discriminatory toward this group of people in the LDS church, in the meantime, it does seem that the church is doing a better job. Hey, we're getting better. It's only a flesh wound. It does seem that the church is doing a better job for LGBTQ plus identifying members than critics give us credit for. What critic? What are you talking about?
Well, it's not the critics he has to worry about. It's all the scientists that he's misrepresented so far in his letter.
Bada bing, bada bang, bada boom. Good one, Jacob.
Yeah, the other thing I'm just struck by, I love that you highlight the fact that there's just obvious double-mindedness in this passage, RFM, because I think that's a really good point. But one of the thoughts I've had about this issue, and Jacob, especially since you're fresher in this space, it'd be interesting to get your perspective on it. But one of the grand promises of Mormonism is that you can be united with your spouse and have an eternal family for forever, right? In Doctrine and Covenant 76, what people sometimes colloquially refer to as the vision, where Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon see this vision of eternity and the kingdoms of glory, one of the descriptors that is applied to people who are not part of the celestial kingdom is that they are separate and single forever. That's the way that it's described as angels. And I've had this thought, how crazy it is to me that in the Mormon church, what they want their LGBT members to do for the rest of their life is to do what their own theology teaches is like a form of an eternal punishment, because it's a lack of what the celestial kingdom's promise is. In other words, to be an LGBT member in the church, now that the church no longer believes or teaches, to its credit, that you can change your sexual sexual orientation based on conditioning and very flawed science and electroshock therapy. Now that they've accepted that science, they basically just recommend, well, we all have challenges, we all have problems, and so as long as you're just faithful and you don't have a relationship, I just can't even think of what that's asking people to do. Like, their own theology recognizes that is basically like a form of eternal punishment in the lack of having this eternal blessing, the highest blessing of the celestial kingdom. The church is basically, in other words, demanding that to meet the demands of the church, because let's remember, Jesus never says a thing about this. Joseph Smith never said a thing about this. So to meet the demands of the church, they're asking their LGBTQ members to be separate and single forever, when in their theology, or for the rest of their lives at least, when in their theology, that is a problem in the eternities. And that they can't see that, and how damaging that would be to someone's psyche, to someone's identity. Like, my relationship with my wife, especially since leaving the church, is the most meaningful thing in my entire life. So the fact that they're asking members who have a different sexual orientation to forego that relationship for the rest of their life just boggles my mind. That is, and to keep comparing it to, like, well, we all have challenges. My great uncle twice removed was born an alcoholic. That comparison needs to die in a fire, because that isn't the same thing. Like, all humans need that type of relationship if they can find it. Anyways, I'm sorry I'm bloviating a little bit, but
it's an excellent point. It's an excellent point. Yeah, the church does try, and apologists do try to liken this kind of issue with any other standard issue that anybody has with keeping the commandments, right?
Mhm.
And the promise is that if you live a single and celibate life throughout your entire life here on earth, then the unwritten portion is that when you're resurrected, you will be made right, so that you will be made heterosexual, so that then you can get married and you can procreate eternally and you can become a god.
Yeah, and the fact that members cannot see the analogy between that teaching and the now repudiated teaching from the church that, you know, members who were not white were going to be made white in the resurrection boggles my mind, because it's the exact same teaching, just applied to a different marginalized group. This teaching, to me, is so offensive and also so antithetical to some of the best parts of Mormonism, which is like, you have innate special parts inside of you. They're teaching that something that's an innate special part of you, part of your identity, is wrong and needs to be corrected in the eternities. Like, that's like someone taking my heterosexuality away from me in the eternities. I wouldn't even be the same person. What's the point of being resurrected, to be someone completely different?
I know, on the other side of coming to the recognition that homosexuality is not something that can be changed or chosen, at least to the outside world, they mention that. I don't know how they really feel, if they still feel the old way, which is that, no, just being homosexual is a sin and it is a choice. And there's lots of members, I'm sure, who believe that still. But you're right. The church has made periodic statements here and there that indicate that some of the leaders have come around to the idea that homosexuality is not a choice. So then you're left with the idea that this is part of my identity, right? I have no choice about it. And the fact that I have no choice about it makes it that much stranger that it has to be fixed, right? It has to be fixed so that I can go to heaven, basically, the top tier of the celestial kingdom. I think we all know what we're talking about. So that I can go to heaven and I can live with a family forever, my family forever, and become like God over something that's not a sin, over something that I did not choose.
Yep. To borrow a phrase from Hitchens, born sick, commanded to be well, on pain of death. That's the situation. That's the reality of the situation. If God created them, specifically created them, they were born, and the church accepts this, they were born with this sexual orientation, and they need to fix it on pain of eternal torture or consequence, however you want to phrase it. That makes no sense. That model of a God is a monster to me. That is just something I could never. Even my time in the church, I was an ally, like Jacob's talked about, because of this. Because once you accept that it's not something someone can choose, it's very problematic from the overarching Mormon theology to accept that God's going to punish them for something they don't choose.
Right. And I expect that Hitchens is talking mainly about the idea of original sin as opposed to what we're talking about.
He is.
Mormonism makes the problem even more problematic because we have a premortal existence where presumably there weren't gay people fighting, against Satan and his forces, that all the spirits were straight up there. I don't know. But if you got gay spirits up there, I don't know why they don't get thrown out with Satan. I'm just saying. But if they're straight spirits, which would be presumably what they would be, who are coming down here to this earth to take upon themselves bodies, that a straight spirit now goes into a body and now becomes gay and then has to be made straight again in the resurrection. Yeah, I don't think God thought this through. Once again, I say, I think it's Isaiah 55 that says God's ways are higher than our ways and his thoughts than our thoughts. And I get that. But if I can come up with a better plan than God can, I think we got a problem.
Yeah. I think something that came to mind as we were having this conversation too is if you're going to try and use science to defend your interpretation or your position, you can't cherry pick the science, because if we want to have a slightly different conversation, the academic scientific consensus is that sex and gender are not the same thing. So if you're trying to embrace science Austin, you should be calling the church out on the family and proclamation to the world, because they get it wrong. Gender's not eternal. It's a social construct. That's what the science says. You believe in evolution because that is like the pillar that biology is built on today. As a field, biology would not exist if you did not accept the theory of evolution. So why don't you call out, the leaders of the church and say, hey, we should be teaching evolution in the classroom or at Sunday school, because that's what happened. That's what science says. So there's just a lot of problems you get into when you cherry pick.
Evolution specifically, more than just the field of biology, I would point out that modern medicine makes no sense except in the light of evolution. In other words, if your kids have ever taken an antibiotic, that's the result of what we understand because of the theory of evolution by natural selection. So that's the other thing that is so mind-boggling to me when I've had theistic people say to me, like, well, you borrow from the Christian worldview to, do whatever. It's absurd to me. It's like, do you drive a car? Do you have a smartphone? Do you take medicine? If so, then you borrow from the scientific worldview and the world of the Enlightenment far more than I borrow ever from the Christian worldview.
Well, science can be a fickle mistress to those trying to use it to prove a religious point.
Exactly. Unfortunately.
So here's the next slide. Did we already go through this? This is from the Light and Truth letter.
Yeah, we just hit this. And the next slide I just have, because Fife says, admittedly, the relationship is complicated. Okay, if admittedly it is, why haven't we admitted it in this letter except for just saying admittedly? There's an entire Wikipedia page under this title, LGBTQ Rights and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And it is an exhaustive list of groups and people and policies that all of this applies to. We've got Proposition 8 with President Gordon B. Hinckley declaring, do all we can to stop the recognition of same-sex marriage in the United States. That, is quite the statement that just goes unacknowledged in this chapter, the Light and Truth letter. And so I just have a couple examples on here. In 1995, the LDS Church began. Oh, yes, go for it.
Can I say one thing about that? So not to get too lawyerly on this, and RFM, please jump in here. But the reason that gay marriage is allowed now in the decision that recognized it was called the Bergefell v. Hodges in 2015. Okay. And one of the bases for that decision is that there is an equal protection clause in the United States Constitution, which says that people are guaranteed equal rights regardless of their gender. And the idea is that if you are discriminating between gay marriage and straight marriage, you are obviously doing that on the basis of that individual's gender. And so I think sometimes Mormons get so wrapped around the axle of what the church has said about same-sex marriage that they don't just stop and think about the reason that people feel differently. Because I felt differently about this when Proposition 8 was going on. I was actually at BYU when the Proposition 8 campaign was going on, and I got approached at the student the Wilkinson Center, whatever it's called, where the student union building on BYU's campus, by people who were saying, like, well, don't you want to follow the prophet and defend traditional marriage and family? And I remember just looking and thinking, but what basis do I have to tell other people how to live their life in a completely different state? That's the other side of this issue. Is the only thing you need to accept gay marriage, this is what I'm really trying to say, is that we should treat people equally on the basis of their gender. That's really the only proposition you have to accept gay marriage from a legal perspective, because there are all types of things that are legal that Mormons don't agree with. I just drank my Moxie Java while we were doing the first part of this episode. They don't believe in coffee, but they don't try and criminalize coffee. And I'm just pointing out that the only thing you need to accept gay marriage, you don't even have to get to any of this science. You just have to believe in the principle that animated the United States Constitution to have a protection for the equal rights of people who are a different gender than you. That's the only thing you need to accept.
Can I give a visual on how the church changes? There's my Diet Coke.
I thought you were going to say, first we go here, and then the world goes here, and then we go here.
If I'd done this 50 years ago, I would have been out of compliance with the Mormon tenets, but now I can drink it without any compunction.
Yeah.
By the way, just to clarify, Colby, and I think you mean this, pretty sure you mean this. The 14th Amendment does not say anything about gender. It was read into it by the Supreme Court. Because, of course, back after the Civil War, they weren't really that concerned about things. Go ahead, Colby.
It doesn't say anything about sexual orientation. You're right. It does protect gender. It's just that they view sexual orientation as part of gender.
Well, I was just going to read it here. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities, there's that clause, of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws.
Okay, as it's been interpreted. You're right. I'm sorry. Yep.
It's okay. It's okay. Some people think that's what we have a Supreme Court for. Some people think that's not what we have a Supreme Court for, and hence the argument. Okay, so are we ready to go to the next one, or was there anything else that you want? Let's not forget 2015 when John Dehlin was excommunicated from the LDS Church, in part because of his visible advocacy for same-sex marriage.
Yeah. And it's interesting how Fife will spin that in the rest of the letter. I feel like often what apologists do, no surprise, is almost that John left of his own accord because he became just increasingly antagonistic towards the church. And in reality, he was kicked out of the church. He was excommunicated. The reality is much different. And that's what we will get into. So yeah, if we could go, and we've already covered this commentary, so we can go to the next slide.
Dangerous precedent. This is from the Light on Truth letter.
Yeah. Would you read the dangerous precedent, RFM?
Yes, I can pronounce that pretty easily because I say it so much. Precedent. What really matters is that LGBT. Okay, now this is supposed to be a quote from John Dehlin with punctuation added. Okay. What really matters is that LGBT Mormons continue to die by suicide. That's true. Mormon mixed faith marriages continue to face intensive distress and sometimes divorce and the destruction of entire family, where children get alienated from their parents. Families get torn apart as some lose their faith. Period. End of quote. I think that's all completely couched in such a way as to be undeniably true.
Exactly. Fife offers no refutation. He doesn't try to refute this at all. The quote is there, and all I can think to say is exactly what you said. This happens. It's factually accurate.
I would point out that Austin's conclusion from the last section was basically that the church is doing a better job than critics give it credit for, right? That was what he ultimately said. Yeah, it's bad because, as RFM pointed out, he wishes that the situation would get better, but it's not as bad as some people make it out to be. When then I read this, combined with what John has here or what he quotes from John, that makes me want to ask, then what level of suicide is acceptable to Austin? That's the natural question that crops up to my mind. Is that uncharitable?
I don't think so.
No, it really is. That's what it's saying. Is it, no matter how bad it might be in the church, it's worse out there. Therefore, church is true.
Yeah. And we're going to talk a lot about John Dehlin for basically the rest of this section. So we can skip the commentary because we've already covered that for the next slide.
We'll do that. Can I just mention to Austin, when you add punctuation, I'm guessing this is because this is something that John Dehlin said. I mean, he talks a lot more than he writes, kind of like me and pretty much anybody else in this space. And he added punctuation. When you put in a punctuation in brackets, that you put in there, what really matters is LGBT Mormons continue to die. He put that the word that there is superfluous and actually should not be added to the sentence. So you could take that out. Okay. Your commentary, Jacob.
Yeah, and I think we've already covered it. Is that this happens and we need to do better, everybody, in and out of the church. And we can go to the next slide when you're ready.
Sorry about that. I was just channeling my inner grammar Nazi for a moment.
To come back to a comment we've all made, if he doesn't offer any substantive commentary on what John says or refute it at any point, I'll just say this helps, again, make my point that this letter is not written to people like us. It's not written to really deal substantively with the issues. It's a polemic written to convince or assuage the already convinced. They know that John Dehlin is a bad dude, and so they're going to look for a quote like that that's pulled out because it already agrees with what they think.
Very good.
Well, you know how it goes. You start having a faith crisis, and you do all you can when you have questions about the LGBT community to prove that the church is actually right by looking up a bunch of Deseret News articles. I mean, that happened to me. I'm just kidding. Okay, so continuing with this dangerous precedent section, basically this is, I think I would call it an ad hominem attack against John Dehlin's.
Oh, can I read it then?
Yeah.
It's got Jacob Hess in it, one of our faves. Okay, so this is Austin Fife. Going back to the limited 2015 John Dehlin dissertation referenced earlier, this highly popular and oft-cited study from John likely suffers from both confirmation bias and sampling bias. Okay, then he defines confirmation bias as uniformity amongst researchers who lead with a conclusion in mind, which is absolutely not happening with this professor at BYU, okay? That's not even happening. This is only happening with John Dehlin, that confirmation bias. And sampling bias, a volunteer online survey being circulated amongst disenfranchised members and former members of the church. In other words, his sampling bias is mainly from people who have left the church. But I think that's the whole point. But anyway, regardless of that, there's another problem with it, which is that it's self-selected. I don't know if he mentions that, but that's another issue. Okay, then he goes on. John's snowball sampling method makes the conclusions of his study highly suspect. Jacob Hess provides a thoughtful critique. You know, this guy, Austin, he's got a future as a GA. They always have to use these adjectives, right? And it's just like, okay, just tell me the facts, okay? I'll decide if it's thoughtful. Jacob Hess provides a thoughtful critique of John Dehlin's study, which means he disagrees with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Question for Jacob Prescott. Do you know anything about Jacob Hess?
I honestly don't know a lot about Jacob Hess. My first exposure to him was trying to look at his thoughtful critique of John Dehlin's study.
Jacob Hess and thoughtful should never be used in the same sentence.
Good to know.
RFM and I did an episode in the last couple of weeks called How Apologists Lie to You. And one of our case studies, probably the most problematic case study, Austin Fife is also in there, but one of the most problematic individuals in that case study is Jacob Hess. We walked through in great detail. I don't want to belabor this point, but we walked through in great detail. And Jacob Hess absolutely lied about the Arizona Bisbee sex abuse case in personal exchanges he had with me and in reporting he did before he worked for the Deseret News. They were out and out lies. So anytime I see his name in Mormon apologetic circles, and I've said this about Austin too, the epistemology on display, the methodology on display, the fact that they're so willing to allow for people who've been proven to lie about something to continue to be leaders in this space or to speak in this space is its own, for me, at this point, red flag.
If I were to call Jacob Hess, Jacob Hesslich, that would be a German joke.
Well, this is good to know. It kind of confirms, because I pulled up this blog post, and one of the things that Jacob Hess says in there is, John Dehlin, at some point during the Mormon Stories timeline, provided this space for other people to come on and ask him questions about his dissertation. And Jacob Hess says, I was going to go, but I couldn't end up making it. And I was like, I wonder why he couldn't end up making it.
I wonder if Jacob was going to go or his anonymous, not named or signaled co-author. Just wondering. Okay.
And then just some quick commentary here on the next slide. It's hilarious to me to call somebody's published dissertation limited, because that went through a rigorous process to even get out for all of us to read and benefit from in the first place.
It's a dissertation.
It's a dissertation.
It's not self-published stuff like, I don't know, the Light on Truth letter.
Exactly. I can't imagine calling a published dissertation limited, because that is a whole other process. But if you don't like his dissertation, look at all of these other articles he's read. Why haven't we addressed any of these? That was just a point that I wanted to throw in there, that he's either an author or co-author of, because it seems like he's done a lot of good work in the area.
But just to bring this home, and I know we talked about this, the study he's talking about from John doesn't even have anything to do with what he's talking about. John's study that he's talking about had to do, it's this one on number 4, right? Sexual orientation change. It was about sexual orientation change and conversion therapy. So even if we accept the way he's describing it, it's still an apples to oranges comparison right off the bat. I just wanted to remind people about that.
And thank you, because it's easy to lose track of it. And even though I emphasized it at the outset, we all emphasized it at the outset, and you keep going on, we're at 2.5 hours, and you can forget about it. And it's important to continue to remind yourself and the audience that he's not even talking about the same thing that John Dehlin was talking about.
Perfect. And then Fife asks, why does the narrative in John Dehlin's dissertation contradict the majority of other scholarly research on sexual minorities in the church? And if you have any questions on that, it does not. Listen to the last 2.5 hours.
Austin, this is why we don't answer your dumb ass questions. When you write things like this, I'm sure you're a perfectly nice guy, but you're coming across as an idiot wrapped up in a moron. That's a dumbass thing to ask. Where you're saying that John Dehlin's narrative, his dissertation, contradicts the majority of other scholarly research. And you're inserting that conclusion into your question again. It's a leading question. And once again, it's a misleading question, because his dissertation does not contradict any that I know of, at least any that you cited, any other scholarly research on sexual minorities in the church. That is a red herring. Okay, just so you know. Austin, you use the word red herring a lot. That's actually a red herring.
Perfect.
Am I right on that, Colby?
I'm sitting here running the math on if I would describe that as a red herring.
It's a lot of things, but it's definitely, I think it's a red herring. The red herring being when you would have the hounds out for the fox, right? And some schmo would drag a herring or a fish across the track and see if they could get the dogs to go after the red herring scent instead of continuing after the fox. So if you go after the red herring, then you're not trained enough to continue going after the thing it was that you were originally pursuing. That's
right.
The idea, I understand it, of a red herring.
Yep, nope, you're absolutely correct there. I think the bigger problem is exactly like you said. He's baking the conclusion into the way he asked the question. So this would, there's a reason that we have prohibitions in court against asking a leading question. It's because it's not fair presentation of the evidence. And let's not forget, again, the point we made at the beginning and I just made. This dissertation deals with an entirely different question. It's like Austin and these apologists have such a simple way of thinking that it's like, this indicates LDS Church bad. This indicates LDS Church good. The reality of the situation, exactly like Jacob really drove home, is these are complex issues that require looking at very discrete pieces. And John's dissertation dealt with one discrete piece of this. It's not as simple as saying LDS Church bad, LDS Church good. They need to move out of this model that just shows and demonstrates such infantilized thinking. The world is not that simple, guys. Like, come on, grow up.
So I'm going to call on Austin not only to change this or delete this question, but to also include an apology to John Dehlin for so badly misrepresenting what it is that John Dehlin's research said.
You can, and Austin, you can email that to radiofreemormon1@gmail.com when you're scheduling the time you can appear with us, and we'll pass the apology along to John. Don't worry.
That's right. This is officially a Light and Truth letter response on a chapter, so we do have to say that, don't we? Austin, pay attention now. Once again, for the 5th time, we are going to issue an invitation to you to come on the show, Radio Free Mormon, with yours truly and Colby, and talk about your letter, okay? You said it was written to the critics. We qualify as critics. So come on and talk about it. We want to have a discussion. We won't be mean. We won't be rude. We won't be cruel. We'll just talk with you about it because we definitely have some questions that we want to ask you about your letter. Okay? Come on, you can do it.
And if there's any question about it, I asked, and RF's name really is First Radio Middle Free Last Mormon, legally.
Yes. When I become a GA, it will be Radio F Mormon. Elder Radio F Mormon.
Elder Radio F Mormon. I look forward to those talks.
Oh, yeah, they're going to be great. They're going to be barn burners. People are going to be staying awake when I talk.
Oh, yeah.
That's the highest compliment you can get when you're giving a talk in general conference is people don't go to sleep on you.
Yep.
Here's the next slide.
Okay, and would somebody just be willing to read the...
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
Before 2015, was John Dehlin considered a neutral party to LGBTQ plus issues in the church? How much ideological uniformity is there between John and his research team? Did his findings surprise him? So this commentary below is from you, I'm assuming, Jacob. Do you want to make that point?
Yeah, and that there's no meaningful way to measure how much ideological uniformity is between John and his research team. It got published. It gets referenced all the time. This is, I would say, a very important piece in the puzzle of constructing what the LGBT experience is in the Mormon Church. It's just well established in the.
Well, why would the findings that conversion therapy attempts either have no effect or they're damaging? Why would that be unusual to Austin? Because that's actually the research that John was doing. He's already changed the research that John was doing from what it originally was to something else. And now he's asking the question about, did these pretended research findings that John did, which he didn't do, did they surprise him? This is how complicated it gets. It's like Joseph Smith said, Austin, write this down. If you start right, it's an easy matter to stay right. But if you start wrong, it is a hard matter to get right again.
Yeah, that comes back to that fractally wrong thing that we deal with this letter so much. That's why when you mentioned the red herring on the last slide, I was sitting there going, there's so much wrong with it. I don't even know where to start. That's how it feels half the time when we read this letter.
It violates so many of his rules. I think it violates all of them. That's why he listed them in the first chapter. He says, I'm going to violate all these.
That's right. Some of them in the same table. The one thing that's so hilarious, too, is he's sitting there accusing John Dehlin of being guilty of like an echo chamber and ideological uniformity with his research team, as if he's not citing work from BYU. Like, come on, give me a break. Are you really going to saw at the same branch that you're obviously sitting on?
And from the same guy who only talks about his letter and this research in his own echo chamber, who won't come on, even though we keep inviting him. He won't come on any other show other than pro-Mormon shows who will not push back against anything he has to say in his letter, and from which he probably got a lot of this information.
Yeah. I don't watch those shows, but I do love Cultural Hall's recaps of them. They're pretty decent. So, and then I think if you just click on the next slide.
The difference with Cultural Hall, by the way, the difference with Cultural Hall, widely known as the most toxic person in post-Mormonism, is that when he comments on things, he actually plays them. Mm-hmm. He will actually play the clips from the other side at length, sometimes the whole thing, and break it up for comments, as opposed to never watching it, playing only the slightest bit, getting bored with it, and then going ahead with all the ad hominems that have nothing to do with what the other person said. So I want to give Cultural Hall props for that, mainly because it's true, and only secondarily because he'll probably be watching this.
Love it. Love it. And then if you just click on the next slide, did John Dehlin's findings surprise him? Yes. If you quote from his TED Talk, The Ally Within, near this mark, he says, perhaps most amazing of all, our data revealed that 0% of our sample reported being able to eliminate their same-sex attraction. Conversely, over 80% of our sample characterized their attempts at sexual orientation change as either ineffective or extremely damaging. So hopefully this answers the question. Yes, he was surprised. He was surprised. And I don't know what else to say about that. But this shocked him and his team, regardless of even if there was ideological uniformity between them.
Well, you answered that question, and John answered the question. And you brought up the fact that John answered his question. Yes, his findings did surprise him. Great find there, Jacob.
Thank you. And then we can skip this commentary because I on the next slide, I definitely.
Hey, I just found out this quote, and I think I found it out from you, and I butchered it recently on a Mormonism After Dark or something with Bill Reel.
Yeah.
It's great. Should you? So this is Dhammapada, some Indian guy, right? Dhammapada.
Yeah, I believe this is a Buddhist teaching.
Some Indian guy. I don't know who it is. I apologize. But it's a great saying. Should you find a wise critic to point out your faults, follow him as you would a guide to hidden treasure. What a great saying. It's the exact opposite of what we tend to do. And has special meaning in Mormonism.
I think so. Oh, yeah. Go for it, Colby.
Well, the guide to hidden treasure part.
I was just going to say, we had that episode that we released last week, RFM. I love this quote. And we had that episode that we released last week dealing with how apologists lie. One of the apologists that we talked about right near the end is a Christian apologist, not a Mormon apologist, named William Lane Craig. We never once accused William Lane Craig of being a liar. It was actually our attempt at an olive branch to say, look at how this very intelligent person, this very credible apologist, gets so wrapped around the axle that he'll argue with a Nobel Prize winning cosmological scientist in the cosmological science. And that was our way of saying, this is the significance of cognitive dissonance and how powerful it can be. So maybe these things that we think are lies are actually just severe cognitive dissonance, right? What I want to point out here is that the day after, I got a call from one of our mutual friends, a post-Mormon Christian friend. I'm sure you know who it is, but I won't.
I do.
Talk about it because I don't have his permission to do that.
Post-Mormon and Christian.
Post-Mormon and Christian still today. And one of the first things I told him is he had pushback for some of the things I said during that segment and the way we played that clip. And the first thing I told him was, thank you so much for reaching out to me and telling me your opinion of this, even though it differs with mine. And I think that's something that we need to be better about inculcating in ourselves and building for ourselves is people and finding those friendships where there are people who will correct us or attempt to correct us. I didn't agree ultimately with his feedback and commentary, but we had a multi-hour conversation about it. And it was a great conversation, one that we may be continuing in the future, even in a way that people can listen to it. But my point is just this, that quote is so important for us because every single one of us, myself included, have the same flaws in the way that we think. We tend to always look for things that confirm what we already think. That's just the way our brain works. We are pattern-seeking mammals, and we will find a conspiracy theory if no other theory will do. And my point is, we have to actively guard against it by building friendships and relationships like that, where we can respectfully correct each other or attempt to correct each other and share our perspectives with each other and not build an echo chamber for ourselves.
Right. And one of the problems, as you've observed, is that Austin restricts his podcast appearances to those who support his view. And out of the 5 or 6 people, other than he, that show up from time to time on Psych Ward Radio, which I think he's been on like 10, maybe more than 10 times now, not once, to my knowledge, not once has any of those 5 or 6 people ever corrected or sought to correct Austin on any assertion he's made or any assertion that's in his letter.
Exactly.
Okay. But we're the wise critics, so follow us, Austin. Follow us as you would a guide to hidden treasure.
Yeah. I'm still a Mormon. I would definitely embrace the label as a critic of the church as well, because I just don't think, like, a food critic doesn't hate all food. Food critic probably likes food. Does that make sense?
Movie critic?
Just pointing out the bad food to make it better. It reminds me of another quote. If I could just read you, I have it up on my phone, and that's what this reminds me of. It says, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it's indifference. You know, the people that Fife labels as critics of the church, I don't think I would hear either one of you, and I certainly wouldn't say that I hate the church. But that's kind of the light that the people he calls critics get painted in the Light and Truth letter. I have so many good experiences with the church. So many of my good friends come from the church. So many of the good principles I've learned in my life come from the church. I don't hate the church. I offer these critiques because this is a huge part of my life, and I want to see the organization change and be better. And I think people who leave the church can do a really good job at pointing out those critiques. And I think that people who stay in the church can also do those things. Anyways, that's just my soapbox for a minute.
Great comments. Great comment.
Yeah, I'm glad you stopped there, because I think that was an important quote to work in here. And then this is also important. Colby, would you read this slide from the Light and Truth letter?
More dumb questions. I'm sorry. No, his heading says dangerous precedent. Are the findings from a volunteer online survey that was disseminated from John's Mormon Stories brand reliable? In bold. Isn't that brand critical of the church? Doesn't the Mormon following of that brand consist mostly of disenfranchised former and current members of the church? Doesn't that meet the criteria for sampling and selection bias?
So two things, and you can click on the next slide because it bleeds into my commentary. So all of that could be true if that's how John Dehlin had given the survey. However, as previously pointed out, this is not how the survey was given. And if you go to the next slide, this is what it says about the methodology. This study was approved by the Institutional Review Board at Utah State University. It was released as an online web survey from July 12th through September 29, 2011, and required both informed consent and a confirmation that the respondents had only completed the survey once. So the characterization that it was just John Dehlin hopping on his podcast and sending out a survey is just wrong.
Okay. Once again, this is blowing my mind. He is now saying things. He's smuggling in these conclusions in his misleading questions. These are more misleading questions now. He is smuggling in conclusions into his questions that are concluding that John Dehlin actually conducted his survey in a manner less reliable than the way he actually did conduct his survey. That's number one. Also, number two, I think that Austin Fife may not understand what has to happen for a dissertation to be approved and be published, and the rigorous process that goes through.
Yeah. And I mean, even if that was the way that it was disseminated, the review board said it was good. And I don't see any reason to reject those are the experts in the field. I don't see any reason to fight against that, even if that was the way it was disseminated.
Well, and the ridiculous thing he's not recognizing is he's acting like Utah State University is going to have like an anti-Mormon sentiment. I'm sure most of the people who work and attend and are in the administration of Utah State University are also Mormon. They probably are interested in this issue and are willing to follow the science wherever it leads. But he's acting like, by linking John's work in his professional capacity or in his academic capacity with his work at Mormon Stories, he's trying to associate John's study, which was an actual academic study at the university, with Mormon Stories in a way that isn't warranted. And in fact, if I were John, I take my professional reputation very seriously. This is something I would tell Austin he's going to correct it or he's going to get sued for defamation, because he's calling into question John's professional ethics and professional academic credibility in a way that is entirely dishonest. Again, I'm tired of calling Austin Fife a liar because I don't know his heart and I don't know his intent. But the end result is the same. This is either a lie or it is made with such reckless disregard for the truth based on his inability to understand the basics of how academics works, that it's equivalent to a lie. And John should hold him accountable for that.
One of the things that's remarkable to me about this letter in this chapter is that there's so many different and valid ways to criticize it, where it falls short. And one of the things I wanted to say about what he said about the John Dehlin survey is he asks all these questions and he makes all these conclusions that are not supported by the evidence. They're contradicted by the evidence. They show he didn't research it at all before even making these comments, or if he did, he didn't understand what he was reading. All right. Now, having said that, here's the difference, okay? This is what Austin does. This is what the Radio Free that's me. That's not what I do. It's you see, they put Word Radio in there, and it's confusing me ever since. This is what Psych Word Radio does, what those blokes do, and the ladies over there too. They're all of the same cloth. And what they do is this kind of thing. Me, on the other hand, last night on Mormonism After Dark, what was going on? We were talking about those 2 posts on Mormon Reddit by Austin Fife. And if you want the details, go back and watch it. But Bill started asking me questions then about how soon after the first one was deleted did Austin put up the second one. And for Bill, it was more favorable to his argument against Austin that time was shrunk and that the second one went up only shortly after the first one went down. And he's asking me about it. And I know what he wants, but on the other hand, I also know I don't know the answer to that. So what RFM does, okay, is he says, I'm not sure. I didn't come with those stats. I know that going this way is going to help our argument, but I don't go there because I don't know the answer. And I would rather be right than come up with another point on my side of the column.
Right, because facts matter to you, and facts don't matter to this crowd. You're exactly right. If Austin cared about handling this in a professional way, I know it's a letter on the internet, and I know he's selling it on Amazon, but a normal person, a normal competent person that was doing what Austin's doing, when they write, are the findings from a volunteer online survey that was disseminated from John's Mormon Stories brand reliable, they would have a footnote somewhere, or in the text above, they would have made the case that the online survey was actually disseminated from John's Mormon Stories brand. They would either have a link to where it's on John's Open Stories Foundation webpage, or the Mormon Stories webpage, or the Mormon Stories Facebook group, or on Reddit, or they would have a report from someone saying that. He just skips that step and assumes that he understands the facts. But as we've laid out, he can't even understand the facts from his own apologetic sources on issues like Nahum. Every time we dig into this letter, I am just struck by how absurd this effort is. If Austin wants my honest feedback, he needs to tear the entire thing down to the studs and start again and do it the right way. Stop assuming you understand what the facts are, because those of us who actually do are so offended by the way you've set this up, because it's so wrong from start to finish. Like, every single bit of this is wrong, or if it isn't wrong, I don't trust that it's right, because you don't know how to make a case in the way that you should be making a case. You need to back up your contentions of fact.
It is a strange and not always pleasant thing to be an attorney. Because I'll tell you what it's like for me, and I bet it's like for you, Colby. You can weigh in too, Jacob. Is everything I say has to be parsed in my head before I say it. Anything factual that I'm saying, regardless of whether it's interpersonal relationships, whether it's the church, whether it's you're in court, everything that I'm talking to the judge, I parse everything in my head at the same time. It's got to be a little bit before I think, but virtually simultaneously with my speaking it, in order to make sure that I am hewing exactly to the facts as I understand them. And if I don't remember something, I'll put in, my recollection is that this is what happened. I always want to be exact in what I say. And I know that's something from training and education, but I can't imagine it's just lawyers who are supposed to have this kind of training and education. Are you supposed to have this kind of training and education too, Jacob?
I mean, yeah, I'm supposed to give the facts to people. And my role as a future physician is, if my patient wants to know some factual evidence, I can present that evidence, not with any of my interpretations in it, but just presenting the evidence to let people draw their own conclusion, right, and make their own informed decision. And the most ethical way to do that is for me to make sure that I know what I'm talking about, which is why I go to 4 years of med school and then 4 years of residency and then enter my own practice and do all of those things. But I have to present it in a way that I'm not making the decision for the person that I'm going to be helping, right? And I feel like that's pretty adjacent to what you were saying. So,
Right. There's no compunction. There's no thought about that in what Austin writes. He will write what he thinks is true, even though if you come to this point and you say, okay, if I'm writing this, all right, this is the difference. If I'm writing this, what's going on in my head is this true? Can I say this? Can I write this and not be incorrect? I'm incorrect enough times, though I go through this process, okay, with virtually everything I say. which is one of the reasons it's so freaking impossible and annoying to talk to a lawyer. All right? Because they're always going to be so strict in what it is that they say that frequently they'll go on and on for 5 minutes about something when the question was just yes or no, and it's just about, I don't know, going to the grocery store today or tomorrow. So that's why it can be very difficult. But on the other hand, it's also a very precise way of thinking. And I would never write a line like this without saying, wait a second, is that correct? I've got to research it. I've got to find out, is that correct? And if it's correct, I leave it. And if it's not correct, then I change it. And I say, I'm glad I checked that out. So I wasn't caught off base. Like Austin Fife gets continually caught off base time after time, just in this chapter alone.
Right. And to use a phrase I've used when we've talked about these types of mistakes in the past, we talked about this with the Nahum mistake in particular. I've taught writing courses to law students, and I've taught how to think to law students. That's what you're really teaching them when you're teaching them a writing course, is you're teaching them how to structure their argument, which is teaching them how to think. This work is fatally deficient at the very bones, at the very foundation, because Austin has not learned the lesson that I don't say shit unless I can back it up, unless I can point to something and say, I said that John disseminated this from Mormon stories. He doesn't even think, what should I go pull to see if that's even correct? Because he didn't even do that basic step. And then the thing that's so insulting is then when he's called on the carpet to account for it, and I bet he'll do the same exact thing here that he did with Nahum, he'll find some way that what he said wasn't wrong ultimately. Like he'll somehow reach the same conclusion, even though he was wrong about the facts. He'll find some way to say, well, people might have known that it was John Dehlin, and so it was associated with Mormon stories, or John's talked about it on Mormon stories after the survey was done. So the link I was making between John and Mormon stories is more in recognition of that. That's not what it says. Stick to what you said. You said that the survey was disseminated through John's Mormon stories brand. And from all intents and purposes, that doesn't seem to be true. Why didn't you care to get the facts right before you reached a conclusion? Before you reached a conclusion is thinking smart and guarding yourself against this. Exactly like RFM said, our brains do it anyways. We make mistakes. The most embarrassing mistake I made in this series was that comment I made off the cuff about the X2A haplogroup evidence. We corrected it in the next episode. I was embarrassed by it. Thank you again to Dr. Thomas Murphy for calling that out. And I could explain why I had misremembered the reason, but the conclusion was right. That's entirely different than doing this Mott and Bailey game where Austin says, yeah, what I said wasn't right, but it still is if you look at it from this different perspective. I'm just tired of that tactic from these apologists. And that's why I like doing this series with you, RFM, because we are precise about what we say, and we're precise about what they say, and we hold them to what they said, and what they said fails time and time and time again when we actually look at the facts.
And we're not even into critical thinking yet. This is foundational. You've got to get your facts straight before you start drawing conclusions from them, before you start thinking about them at all. Right. If you don't have your facts straight, no amount of critical thinking is going to derive a valid conclusion. Next slide.
I think all this proves is that he's just a guy who wrote a letter.
He's just a guy who wrote a letter.
No, the commentary on this slide is everything.
By the way, everybody, Jacob is referencing a quote from Austin Fife on Mormon Reddit. That's what he said. Hey, I'm just a guy who wrote a letter. That's all I am.
He said, what he said was,
that's the Bailey or the Mott. I can't remember which one. That's the retreated position, right?
He said something like, critics have been so desperate to paint me in a bad light with malice or with this desire to be dishonest. And I'll set that aside and say, you know what? You're right. I shouldn't have called you a liar so regularly, but the end result is the same. And the fact that you don't see the difference, the fact that you don't see that your work matches lies because it's so incompetent is its own red flag at this point, Austin. Like how anyone could be convinced by this effort is insane to me. If there is one person who had a faith crisis, a real faith crisis, and deconstructed that found this letter and it led them back to church or it led them back to faith, I sincerely want to hear from that person. Email RFM at radiofreemormon1@gmail.com and he'll send it to me because I want to hear it. You're muted. I got to say it this time. You're muted. You're muted. You're still muted.
Myself. And then I was looking something up, and that's why I was muting myself so you couldn't hear me typing. And then I was still on this other page. I finally understood the Mott and Bailey fallacy, okay? And so I want to understand which is which. Here it is. It's a Mott and Bailey. It's a kind of castle. It's sort of a primitive kind of castle. But the Mott is the hill. It's in the middle. There's a wall around it, and then there's a raised earthwork in the middle, and there's a structure built upon it, which is like the siege place, right?
That's the Bailey, like the old
It's the
Bailey.
last resort. Yeah. No, the Mott is the hill with the fortified keep on top.
Oh, the Bailey isn't the tower on top, though?
The Bailey is the larger fenced area.
I've had it wrong.
The
I'm
Mott,
sorry.
The Mott is, hang on a second. The Mott is Gondor, and the Bailey is Pelennor Fields. Does that help you?
Do you mean Minas Tirith?
Well, Gondor has the, it has the White Tower in it, yes. Oh, I got it. Okay, you went up to me in your nerdiness.
Always.
You went nerd factor 10 on me, and I wasn't expecting it. But actually, the thing is that, so the Mott is the little mount in the middle. Motte is the little hill in the middle, surrounded by the wider area with the fence, right? So the Mott is the hill with the fortified keep on top. The Bailey is the larger fenced area. So his Mott argument is this is evidence for the Book of Mormon, what he puts in his letter. But when he's called on that, as in Zosimus, where it was presented as evidence for the Book of Mormon, it got decimated. So he retreated. Well, wait a second. Maybe I've got this wrong. Maybe I still have it backwards, but the Mott is the hill in the middle with a fortified keep on top. The Bailey is the larger fenced area. So it's the Bailey. It's where he's out there and he's fighting, right? And this is evidence for the Book of Mormon. But when he gets defeated in the Bailey, he retreats to the Mott, which is the keep on the little mountain or the little mound of earth. He retreats to there and says, I'm getting killed out here in the larger area in the Bailey. So now I've got to retreat to the Mott.
Right.
So the place where he got killed was Zosimus' evidence for the Book of Mormon. He got smashed on that. So he retreats to the Mott, and the Mott is, no, it's not really evidence at all. And I'm just a guy writing a letter. That's all I am.
Yeah, and the predictable Mott and Bailey I see coming on this. Thank you for getting that straight. I corrected you last time, and I was wrong. The Mott is the retreated to position, the more easily defended position. So again, we can correct each other when we're wrong. It's good to have friends like that, right? Thank you for correcting me. I won't get it wrong again until the next time I do.
We won't talk about the 14th Amendment, though.
Yeah, the Mott and Bailey, the Mott and Bailey that I see coming on this one is exactly what I said. So he says that John distributed this survey through Mormon Stories. And I guarantee the way he's going to say, oh, I'm still right about this, is because John has talked about it repeatedly on Mormon Stories after the study was done. Those are completely different things. And the real problem with the Mott and Bailey is we should be grateful and reward people and compliment people when they change their position in light of new facts. The problem with the Mott and Bailey is they act like they didn't make the original misstatement and correct themselves. They act like there is an equivalence between two not equivalent positions and say, I was still right.
And the next day when they're facing another opponent, they'll come out of the Mott and go into the Bailey again.
Right.
Until and unless they get called on it in the Bailey and have to retreat again to the Mott.
Right.
So the Bailey is the preferred place where they'll stay until they're called on until they're called on their argument not being valid.
Right.
Okay. Did you have anything you wanted to say about this slide anymore, Jacob? I'm sorry if we were losing you there.
No, it's all great. I love just being here more than anything.
Well, it's great having you.
Thank you. I think we can actually move on to several slides ahead.
Okay. There's another dangerous precedent slide with another dangerous question from.
Yeah. He just says, why does John Dehlin tell people to leave the church? And if you go to the next slide.
Read it. I mean, this is important stuff.
Okay.
Austin writes, my biggest concern with John Dehlin is how heavy-handed he can be with the conclusions of his admittedly limited study. What if he is just wrong? What if that whole question was just wrong? I mean, there's so many things in that are problematic now that I understand the facts as you laid them out, Jacob. Then he asks, isn't pressuring same-sex attracted individuals to step away from faith communities, marriages, family, and personal commitments? Bullshit, Austin. Bullshit on you. I'm calling bullshit on you again right there. That's bullshit. When did John Dehlin ever pressure homosexuals to step away from marriages, to step away from family, to step away from personal commitments? When?
Yeah, let me give the steel man,
and you're a liar.
a lying liar who lies. Let me explain why that's a lie.
Just click on the next slide real fast.
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay.
I have a straw man. There you go. That's all. Continue, Colby.
Oh, there's a straw man up there. I like it.
How? Oh, you're saying that it's a straw man. You wanted to make sure that we didn't steal your thunder. What
like
I wanted to say is the entire reason that John Dehlin was excommunicated from the church is because he wasn't doing that. Is because he was looking at the science that says people don't choose to be LGBTQ plus. It's part of their identity. It's something that they cannot choose. It's innate in them. And he was saying, hey, LDS Church, look at these negative effects that we see from what you used to recommend about sexual orientation change therapies. He was trying to get the church to change its policy so that there was room in the church for LGBTQ members to have full faith and fellowship in the church. So what he's doing, what John was actually doing, is the exact opposite of what what Austin said that John was doing. John was trying to tell the church that it needs to make room for these people, not to fit inside these strict boxes the way the church has defined them, not pressuring them to leave. He was trying to make room in the church for those people, and that's why he was kicked out. This is so absurdly bad faith, the way that he cut John Dehlin to say the exact opposite of what John wanted to say, or was saying, and was kicked out of the church for saying. This is absurd and insulting.
Must be one of the reasons it's getting me so hot and bothered. This is not just a lie. This is a damnable lie. Jacob, I want you to talk about your straw man over here.
I mean, I think you've covered it. And like I lay out right here, none of Dehlin's referenced work, scientific or from his podcast, encourages people to leave faith communities, families, marriages, commitments, and all the other things that he listed. This is absolutely a straw man argument.
I just call it a lie.
It's it's horribly, horribly, horribly misinformed or a lie, and neither are great. And the only real critique, the closest thing I can find to any sort of scientific critique of Dehlin's study is Dr. Hess's blog post, because Dr. Hess, I believe, has a PhD in psychology. That's the closest thing I can find to a scientific critique is a blog post by another person with a PhD. And then I think
who now works for the Deseret News.
Yeah,
now works for the Deseret News.
Deseret News. Can I also just say, this may be obvious, but the benefit to smuggling your conclusion into your question, as Austin does over and over again, is that you don't have to prove it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, normally, if you're using this correctly, this question would come at the end of a great deal of research and analysis that establishes each of the conclusions that are in your question. Okay? Then you can have a question like this. But how Austin uses it is in the incorrect way, which is he doesn't establish any of these elements. In fact, they're contradicted by the actual facts, and he uses them anyway in order to give a false impression and not have to prove it.
Yep. And that's why, Austin, we have not answered all of the questions you've asked. That's why instead we've talked about these issues in greater detail, because when you haven't actually proven the facts as you state them in your question, and oftentimes the facts are in complete contradiction to the way you think the facts are, again, whether you're intentionally misrepresenting or just so incompetent that you don't understand what you're reading or aren't even doing basic research, regardless of how you get there. That's why it's ridiculous for you, in defense of some of these critiques, to say, I'm the one asking the questions here. It's exactly like RFM said, the situation where someone says, well, how long has it been since you stopped beating your wife, sir? That's the same exact thing. That has an proven factual assertion in the way the question is asked, and you do that constantly. That's why people aren't answering your questions, and why people call the questions stupid, because they are. I'm sorry, that's not ad hominem, but you need to understand why before you continue with this effort. You can't bake your conclusions into the premise of your question constantly.
Right, because the question where it's done is always going to be, once again, stating the obvious, a yes or no question. All right. It's not going to be open-ended. These are all yes and no questions. So you are forbidden from answering it yes, because it's not okay to pressure people to step away from faith communities, marriages, family, and personal commitments. You can't say yes to that, right? You're compelled to say no. But by saying no, you're accepting the built-in conclusions. So
Right.
that's why this is so commonly used by people who are trying to sell you something that's fake.
And then on the next slide, I just like pointing out there's a research tool that says, kind of in the middle of this second paragraph, this single work by John Dehlin has been cited 4 times and referenced 210 times in other scientific articles. It's far from being a limited study. This is still something that's being referenced by other experts in the field to lay a basis for the LGBT experience within religion. It's not something that's out there and like just dismissed by experts in the field.
Is the term limited study like a term of art that means something specific in the community of these studies? What does he
every
even
study
mean
be
by
limited in some way?
I don't know. I don't know how I would characterize a study as being limited. That's usually not
possible. Is it possible that Austin thinks it's a limited study just because it was like a survey with, I think it was like 1,600 responses? That's how all studies are done. Like we extrapolate from a representative sample to the whole. That's how. Is that possibly what he's talking about? Limited.
I think that's why he believes it's a limited study. Yes.
But of course, the studies that he cited that have the same exact methodology, because all studies have that methodology of using a sample and extrapolating to the whole, those aren't limited studies.
I guess not in Austin's mind.
Okay.
No. And that's why, of course, the bigger the study as one component, the more likely it is to represent that group.
Well, and that's where confidence intervals come in from statistical methodology, but we won't go there. Okay.
By the way, before we go to the next slide, we're just going to pause for a message from our sponsor.
Hello, friends of Mormon Discussion Incorporated. I'm Bill Reel, founder and CEO, reaching out to our incredible community. Our mission is to support those examining the truth claims of Mormonism and those redefining their relationship with it. Our acclaimed lineup of podcasts, including Mormonism Live, Radio Free Mormon, Mormon Discussion, and others, offers a space for truth and healing. But we need your help. Your donations power our work, expanding our outreach, improving our content, and creating new initiatives. Visit MormonDiscussions.org, click the donate button, and make a difference today. Donate to your favorite show, like this one, as your support empowers us to empower others. Thank you for being a part of the change. Together, we're making real impact.
Thank you, Bill. Isn't he a damn fine looking man? That's all I've got to say about Bill Reel. He's a great guy, and it's a great message. And when he says donate to something like this show, he means Radio Free Mormon. Just to make that clear.
And when someday I am actually making money, I will do that. But everybody else definitely should sponsor.
You don't donate to the show?
If I was making money, I probably would.
Off the stage. Off the stage at once. No, let's continue on.
Great.
Next slide. Again, dangerous precedent. These are all under the section in the Light and Truth letter called dangerous precedent.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Can I read this one?
Yeah.
Okay. The problem for John is the fact that I keep misrepresenting what he really said. That would be honest. Of course, that's not in there. Here's what Austin actually says. The problem for John and other critics is that most of the other reliable evidence regarding LGBTQ plus identified individuals and the church comes to different conclusions than they do. So wait a second. Most of the other reliable, let's just take it for granted. that he's already saying apples and oranges with John Dehlin's research, okay? And that what he's really talking about is not what John Dehlin researched, but this idea that gay people might be better off outside the LDS church than inside it, okay? And what he's saying is that their problem is that most of the other reliable evidence on this issue comes to a different conclusion, which is he's saying most reliable evidence says LGBTQ plus people are better off in the church than outside the church. Did I parse that correctly, Jacob?
That's what Fife is saying. Yes.
He goes on. It says, oh, here he's going to paraphrase, I guess. While quoting, I have to put the quote in quote marks. It says, we found that Mormons who reject an LGBTQ identity. So he's paraphrasing the conclusion of this research he's talking about. Okay. It says, we found that Mormons who reject an LGBTQ identity were significantly more religious and less content with their sexuality, but had similar health outcomes relative to LGBTQ Mormons. He's got a footnote there, footnote 22. Is this a quote from some research?
It is actually a quote from some research. And it's basically saying, like it says in there, people who reject their identity and orientation are more religious and less content with their sexuality. But their health outcomes, mental and physical, were the same as other LGBTQ Mormons. Which can be a little confusing, especially when you take it out of context of what.
Wait. Okay. So he's saying, and by the way, I misunderstood what he was saying because he used the word it to lead into it. He should have said, Austin, say this research says, or this research concludes, and then quote it. So I won't be confused as to whether you're trying to quote John Dehlin and the critics or whether you're quoting the research, okay? The research says, we found that Mormons who reject an LGBTQ identity, so straight Mormons, we found that straight Mormons were significantly less content with their sexuality? What?
Yeah, so what this researcher found, right? You have LGBTQ Mormons who are still Mormon, and you have those same people, but they've decided to live a straight lifestyle.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And the health outcomes between those two groups were the same.
So these are Mormons who are LGBTQ, but they reject that identity because it's not copacetic with Mormonism, and they pretend to be straight.
Yeah.
I think I'll read that last sentence where Austin kind of restates it because I think it kind of drives home what he's trying to say or what the research is trying to say. Said differently, LGBTQ identifying members of the church who reject the LGBTQ label had similar health outcomes as members of the church who identify as LGBTQ.
Which I don't know how this helps his point.
No, but I can understand why people in that category would be significantly more religious because they've got to work night and day to pray the gay away.
Yeah.
They're significantly more religious, but they're less content with their sexuality because they're pretending to be something they're not.
To your point, Jacob, what this is actually saying to me is that there's no point in being an LGBT Mormon who rejects the LGBT label. Because if the health outcomes are the same and we're dealing with scientific questions, this is where Austin constantly wants to have it both ways, whether he's dealing with faith questions or scientific questions. If we're dealing with science and the health outcomes are the same, well, regardless of whether you reject that LGBTQ label, then there would be no reason to reject that LGBTQ label.
Yeah. Well, and I think we should add some context in the commentary slide, because what these researchers have a section called What We Are and Are Not Saying, because the results can be a little confusing. And that's in the middle of the screen. Would one of you mind reading the red?
Colby?
I got it. Our data do not permit us to offer concrete advice to sexual minority Mormons about the best way to resolve conflicting sexual and religious identities, which is hilarious because that's exactly what Austin Fife is using this research to do. And they're very carefully capping it off and say, we don't think this data allows us to do that. And yet Austin is using it to do exactly that. Again, completely incompetent in how he understands these sources. I'm going to go back to the passage now. Rather, they show that people can flourish both by adopting an LGBTQ identity and by rejecting such an identity. Okay, so that makes me feel a lot better because that's exactly what I just said before we read this caveat from the authors. Though we have offered our interpretation of our findings in light of the research literature, more research is needed to better understand the specific mechanisms that explain this parity of outcomes. The fact that this line exists in this source that he has footnoted, and he's using it in direct contradiction to what the authors say, is so problematic and insulting. Wow.
Well, especially because this is the Q&A section, right? I mean, for me, if I'm coming to a subject that I really don't understand, or even if I do, I'm going to go right to the Q&A, because there I'm going to get the synopsis and the basic nuts and bolts of it before I start trying to process the entire thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This study also measured, I think, more physical health than it did mental health. And so this is kind of a different ballpark than Dehlin's study and some of the other studies we've been looking at.
Right.
Yeah. So that's what I have
to
to
this,
say about this.
coming back to this common theme of science is more complicated than good, thumbs up, or bad, thumbs down. It's often very carefully caveated, because often researchers, to your point about how attorneys are very careful about their contentions of fact, researchers are very careful about that as well, to the point that these researchers built in a section of their paper that says, here's what we are saying and here's what we are not saying, because they were wary that people like Austin Fife were going to use this research to make points that they're saying the data does not support this. That's crazy to me. It's right there. What we are not saying is exactly what Austin Fife cites the source to say. Insane.
Right. And he's also basically citing it to support his idea that the mental health of LGBTQ people in the church is better than outside the church, even though the story basically gives it a kind of an even sort of thing with the physical health. But it's physical health in the study, and he's not making that clear here. He's basically using it to promote his already stated conclusion that mental health is better for LGBTQ people in the church than outside the church, when the study actually deals only with physical health.
Right.
And doesn't stand for that proposition anyway, as it states here.
Yeah, this is great. RFM, would you mind reading this one?
Once again, from the Light and Truth letter, I believe that John truly cares about people who identify as LGBTQ+. And I give him credit for that. In his 2013 TED Talk, wait a second, he actually listened.
Makes it worse. He actually listened to it and he didn't understand it.
He listened to it, or at least he says he listened to it. He doesn't have the excuse of ignorance. That reminds me of something else about Austin Fife that we covered in a prior episode. But 2013 TEDx Talk, The Ally Within, John discusses how members of the church can support our LGBTQ+ brothers and sisters, and it seems to come from the heart.
Which is exactly what I said. This is exactly what I said. This is what John says. This has been John's message. It's directed to the church about how to accept and love these people, not telling them. This is crazy. This is a blatant contradiction between what we had just several slides ago from Austin, where he's saying, why is John encouraging people to leave the church? And then right here, he has it. John isn't doing that. John isn't doing that. Like, this is lying, Austin, or it's equivalent to lying. You're saying that he pressured same-sex attracted individuals to step away from faith community marriages, family, and personal commitments. Go forward again. Sorry. And then you listen to it and say he discusses how members of the church can support our LGBT brothers and sisters. Those are completely contradictory things. You're a liar. You're a liar. Or if you're not lying, if you don't have the intent to lie, you need to stop, because you're doing so much harm with the way you're doing this. People are going to read this and not see the obvious problems with what you've done. And you're lying about people, or you're putting stuff out into the world that is the equivalent of lying about people. And you need to stop.
Well, he's not done yet.
You can tell there was caffeine in this. Sorry.
However, he says, in spite of the fact that John really seems to care, and this comes from his heart, however, I'm concerned that his podcast and opinions create worse outcomes for the hundreds of thousands of Latter-day Saints he is professing to help by persuading them to leave the church. There he did it again. He did it in the very next sentence. He's persuading them to leave the church. Okay. I especially worry about the LGBTQ plus identifying brothers and sisters who listen to his podcast. God forbid they should listen to John Dehlin's podcast, hear him recommend that they leave the church. They leave the church and they find out it's much worse out here for us than it was back in the Mormon church.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot to talk about here. And a lot of it is just the same stuff. Dehlin's never encouraged individuals to leave the church, and can use he as far as my understanding is, he wrote an essay called Stay LDS, and he funds the website called Stay LDS.
That was his first thing, his first podcast, as far as I know.
Oh, okay.
And I think it was a podcast. Maybe it wasn't, but it was Stay LDS. It was like Bill Reel 1.0.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure
people in the church.
I'm pretty sure it was a podcast. Yeah.
And if you go to the next slide, between these time marks in this Mormon Stories episode, John Dehlin says he references people still, even if he works with people who are interested in hearing what he has to say on Stay LDS. He's like, yes, you can go and read that if you're looking for good reasons to stay in the LDS church despite hard circumstances. And so, to say that Dr. Dehlin is encouraging people to leave the church, it's just, it's verifiably wrong, because he works with people to evaluate their life circumstances and make an informed decision. And I don't want to put words in his mouth, but
it would actually be unethical for a person with John's training to encourage a person to either leave the church or stay in the church.
Yes.
Just like with Julie Hanks.
Yeah. If that was happening, he wouldn't have his PhD. It would be stripped from him.
Would it be? Do you think it'd be stripped?
Probably.
Wow.
Well, maybe if it were bad enough.
Yeah.
Oh, you think so? Maybe I'm remember.
Well,
I'm sure Jacob Hansen is writing letters as we speak.
Surely. But that's a majority of the point that I wanted to make, is that Dr. Dehlin, I've listened to lots of Mormon stories. I've listened to lots of Radio Free Mormon, and I've never heard anybody ever say, hey, yeah, blanket recommendation, leave the Mormon church. In fact, I've never heard that. I've kind of heard the opposite, or at least the middle ground of that stance, which is make an informed decision based on your life and your circumstances.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Why do you think that apologists are so afraid of that recommendation, whether it's coming from post-Mormons or folks like Julie Hanks? Why are they so afraid to allow people to live their lives and to claim their autonomy?
Because few people are as scared of free agency as Mormons.
Free agency and how to enforce it, right?
Yes, free agency and how to enforce it. This is an interview that John Dehlin did some time ago. Rick Bennett apparently interviewed him. I don't know why Rick Bennett hasn't contacted me to interview me. What's up, Rick?
It's a good interview.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So is that everything you had to say about this slide?
Yes, and that's everything I have to say about that slide.
More dangerous precedent from the Light and Truth letter. Can I ask this question? This is the question that Austin asks. I'm reading it.
Oh, yeah.
If John was objectively looking at the collective research, wouldn't he be justified in convincing sexual minorities to stay in the church and be more religious? So nothing says I'm mischaracterizing the evidence than to mischaracterize it from the other side.
Yeah. And then again, like you just pointed out, he can't do that in his professional setting. He can't tell people to leave, and he can't tell everybody to stay. And the scientific evidence does not support the interpretation in this chapter of the Light and Truth letter.
Yeah, I think the collective research sounds eerily reminiscent of the collective witness model, wouldn't you say?
I guess I might be unfamiliar with that, but
the collective witness model?
Maybe.
Go for it, Colby.
The collective witness model is Jacob Hansen's patented. It's his patented epistemology that he uses to arrive at whatever conclusion he wants to. Literally, he creates different types of evidence.
5 of them, right?
5 of them. And although I think he's toyed around with adding a 6th, it's really stupid, Jacob. that's weird since we're talking about Jacob Hansen's model, but
Yes.
Jacob Prescott, it's really stupid. I have colloquially referred to it before as, and so is Colch and RFM, as the selective witness model, because you basically just get to pick whatever reality you want. Colch actually was texting me. He was running Jacob's write-up of the selective witness model through ChatGPT and getting it to analyze it. And it highlighted this same exact problem, that it basically allows you to just select to be true whatever you want.
Well, you got 5 things that you can select from, and only one of them will lead you to Mormonism is true. Well, that's the one you lean on. If you got 2 you can twist, and you can do 2. See, and then you discount the others that don't apply and don't lead you to that conclusion. Do you have your phone with you, Colby?
Mhm.
Can you look up that text? Because I saw it too. I thought it was hysterical. This is what AI says when you plug in and ask the question about the collective witness model.
It says potential for misuse. So this is a red flag that ChatGPT caught with Jacob Hansen's selective witness model. The model risks being used to dismiss legitimate concerns by overemphasizing spiritual witnesses and minimizing the importance of historical and logical evidence. This can discourage critical thinking and lead to an unbalanced view of the church's history and teachings. Anytime we talk about stuff that comes from AI, I always have to give the careful caveat that these types of models, that doesn't mean that ChatGPT says it, that it's true. But what it means is that the way it's been trained to think about these things, if you properly put in the question and you know the limitations of AI, it can do this type of analysis and tell you the problems with that when you're relying on the best epistemological models.
Yeah, I love that. I love that that description. It's like Jacob Hansen just got pantsed by a computer.
Again.
So next slide.
Yes, go to the next slide. This is Fife's concluding thoughts about the whole thing. And actually, I think we should just skip it because I have more important concluding thoughts.
Really?
I think so. And I threw these in here this morning. If you want to get an understanding of what it's like to be an active Mormon and an ally, or an active Mormon and part of the LGBT community, and you're trying hard to make it work, I threw up some accounts just on Instagram that you should follow. The Fourth Option, Charlie Bird, to all the latter gays, Exponent 2, Come Follow Me Ally. There's dozens more out there. And I think that they all do a fine job at advocating for healthy relationships in the church, at talking about what it's really like to be part of this community in the LDS church, the good parts and the bad parts. And I think that everybody should take a look at least some of these accounts to get a fuller idea and a fuller picture, because on its face, it kind of sounds contradictory to be LGBT and in a high demand religion, especially a very conservative high demand religion, right? It kind of sounds contradictory, but there are people out there who are trying to make it work. It's a grassroots effort, and it can be really tough, but they make it work. And I applaud them, and I think everybody should, well, maybe I won't say everybody should support, but I definitely support them because it's hard work. There you go.
Yeah, and can I say that not only are they making it so that other straight members of the church get to know people in the church who are gay, and it's harder to, hate them or to other them if you know some people. But not only that, I think they're also standing as a banner or a beacon, perhaps, to those other people in the ward or in the stake who are secretly, up to this point, LGBTQ, and giving them the courage and the support to come forward and live their true lives.
I would also recommend, in addition to the options you have here, the first episode of Mormon Stories I ever heard in my entire life was Matt Easton, the individual who Elder Holland talked about, not by name, but referenced his graduation commencement talk in his musket fire speech. That was the first episode of Mormon Stories I ever listened to where Matt talks about his experience growing up in the LDS church, the self-hatred that he was raised with. It's very similar to David Archuleta's experience and basically the whole idea of his song Held Together. And I'm not kidding. I was listening to that. The only reason I listened to the Mormon Stories episode is by chance of the YouTube algorithm. I went to go listen to Holland's original talk because there were so many people criticizing him and I hadn't listened to it. I listened to Holland's talk, And then for some reason, Matt's interview on Mormon Stories was the very next thing the algorithm popped up, like called out by Mormon Apostle. And the talk did not sit right with me anyways, fully believing Mormon at the time. And as I listened to Matt's story, I'm going to get emotional. I'm sorry. My heart was broken for people who are in that boat. And to me, one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard in Mormonism was Carolyn Pearson's song, I'll Walk With You, where she talks about if it's a primary song. If you don't walk as most people do, some people walk away from you, but I won't. And she's talking about, to me, the real gist of Christianity is when Christ was asked what the greatest commandment is, it was to love God and love other people as yourself. Upon all that, hang the law and the prophets, is what Jesus said. So for people who are awful towards the LGBTQ community in the church, I don't know how they can reconcile that conflict with the clear message from my perspective of what Christianity means and the only good that ever comes out of it. I don't care if you're Jacob Hansen or Austin Fife or the president of the United States. If we can't recognize that that is the overall message of what Christianity means, the best of what Christianity has to offer, then we have truly, truly lost the plot.
Jacob?
I think that is a beautiful, beautiful way to end. I don't have anything more to offer. I agree. I think of the scripture, that we are supposed to bear one another's burdens, to make them light. Even people that we don't understand, even people that we're trying to empathize with, but we don't understand their full story. That to me is probably one of the most beautiful things that I've ever learned in Mormonism. Is that baptismal covenant? That's what it is, right? And this chapter of the Light and Truth letter just falls so short on that message. We need to do a much better job at reaching out and being empathetic, especially to this marginalized group of people.
Well, Austin said we need to do a better job. He even hopes that Latter-day Saints will do a better job.
Yeah, well, I think
kind of ironic, isn't it?
Actually interpret the science and what it says correctly instead of misrepresent it, because that would drive him to much better and more correct conclusions.
I know we said a lot of things and it made a lot of observations about things that are odd and contradictory in this letter. But it does strike me as especially odd that at one point he knows he's supposed to say he hopes that Latter-day Saints will be better, more welcoming to LGBTQ plus people. But then right after saying that, he launches into a complete bastardization of research and an attack on John Dehlin, which is equally as baseless, which seems to me to be doing the opposite.
I would agree. It is doing the opposite.
Okay. All right, Jacob, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been wonderful.
Yeah,
thank you for doing all the work
for
on this and doing the research and looking up the studies and the hyperlinks and everything, and bringing your own level of expertise in reading these kinds of things on a regular basis to the fore and applying it here.
Well, thank you. Like I've said this before, but like Dan McClellan says, think critically and Google competently. Anybody can do it.
Very good. Colby, it's been a pleasure as always. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that Austin will watch this show and he'll be making a lot of corrections to his Light on Truth letter. Okay?
He'll correct the details and the conclusions won't change. It'll be amazing.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how honest he is about things. He says he's honest. He's just a guy writing a letter. And so I'm sure he'll take this criticism and he'll evaluate it, realize that we're right, and change his Light on Truth letter down to a paragraph. All right. That's it for now. Thanks again, everybody. This is Radio Free Mormon signing off the air.